Yeah, that was my big year. What was that?
Fantastic.
Yeah. And then it was downhill from then on.
So we're resuming this week with in the book Millennia and Microcosm with the introduction, chapter 2, time, history, and nature. And we're gonna be very text driven while we work our way through this, because there's a lot in here. This is unlike the previous book. You know, I'm going to probably say this for the next few weeks as people come and go. Unlike the previous book, this one isn't ad hoc essays that he wrote on an email list. This is a book that he wrote as a column for the Comics Journal, and he put a lot of time and thought into it. So it's a lot more carefully constructed than what we spent the last year reviewing. And as a result, his use of language is a lot more tuned up. There are a lot of passing references to things where he manages to inject a lot more meaning into a sentence than it would be apparently obvious. So one of the things that I can help with as we go through this is I can decode a little bit of that for you, sort of point out, and you can start to pick up the ways that he's using language by doing that and what he's really meaning. If you guys are game, we could.
Yes, we are game. I love this actually, Rick.
Excellent.
I love this. But you know, I'm a diehard learner, so there you go.
So we begin with his opening sentence, in which he has several ideas there. The very clash of meanings. He opens with that phrase, the very clash of meanings of the millennium. And so, you know, the millennium is, of course, referring to Y2K. He was writing this in '98. As Y2K was approaching, getting ready for the Comics Journal. And he took it as an opportunity to say, well, if moderns have, because of their fears about Y2K, if just for a moment they have broken at least a little bit free of the usual shell of despising history and not wanting to look at the past, and they're starting to reflect about how we got here, maybe this is an opportunity to talk about the things that we don't normally talk about, our big blind spots. You know, how did we get here? Where did we come from? And based on that, who are we, given that that's who we grew out of? So he wants to take that opportunity, but right off the bat, he's talking about a clash of meanings. And part of what he's talking about, he's doing the thing that Heraclitus does, where he uses language to make puns so that he can insert two different meanings at the same time into the same phrase. So on the one hand, the clash of meanings of the millennium is, how do we interpret the approaching Y2K differently from each other based on our different cultures and our backgrounds, right? That would be a modernist interpretation, that there's a diversity of views, and so we look at the same event differently. But that's not all he's talking about, right? Because as a philosopher, he's also interested in epistemology. How do we know things? And axiology, right and wrong, and ontology, the nature of existence. So part of what he's getting at is, how do we in general decide what things mean in the world? How do we process events in order to assign meaning to them? And what he's getting at here is that this isn't the first millennium that we've had in recorded history, and that Y1K, notoriously during the Middle Ages, you know, there was a lot of concern about end of the world stuff. There was a line in medieval Christianity, a thread that was interested in apocalyptic endings as foretelling the return of Jesus. And from time to time, you would find cults rise up that were like, well, can we bring about the end of the world so that Jesus will come back? Because we all want to be done with this and move on to the good stuff, which we think will come after it's all destroyed. This was not the major thread. This was considered a heresy by the medieval church. But it couldn't be repressed because they put the Apocalypse of John at the end of the New Testament, and it just kept causing people to rethink, oh, if only we could just end the world, then, you know, Jesus would come back, which we saw happening at Y2K as well. There was this resurgence of millennialism, which was an entirely, on the one hand, it was a very different way of interpreting Y2K than the people who were concerned about dates and software. But on the other hand, the way that modern Christians interpreted that idea was different than the way medieval Christians interpreted that idea. And that's because medievals and moderns assign meaning to the world in different ways. the way that the lens systems, which he's going to allude to later in this paragraph, by which we look at the world and translate it into meaning, for a medieval were completely different than they are for a modern. Even moderns who believe that they are being as reactionary as possible, who believe that they're trying to precisely, perfectly recreate a Y1K mentality, a medieval mentality, are failing to do so because they're moderns. They interpret as moderns first, and then they cloak themselves in these other things to attempt to sort of, like the Society for Creative Anachronism, they believe they're recreating a value system that's important to them, but they're unable to do so because they're not doing so from the position of a medieval peasant embracing these things. They're doing so from the position of a modern trying to embrace these things, and instead embracing a modified version of it, a modernized version of it, that's actually quite alien to and antagonistic to the set of meanings that people had in Y1K. In the very act of attempting to draw themselves closer to become modern day medievals, they're actually becoming very, very different from medievals while believing that that's what they are. So one of the themes in this paragraph is the way in which we assign meaning to the world, and the way that we do it isn't the way that we think we're doing it. We get this incoherence between the things that we think we're doing and the actual outcomes that we're producing. That's reminiscent of the way that in a tragedy, when you get to the third act, you get to peripeteia, and in peripeteia, all your virtues become vices. All the things that were strengths leading up to this point, now those exact same strengths are working against you. So Oedipus unravels his own position as king and destroys his position and ends up tearing out his own eyes, right? And it's not because at the turning point, he did something differently than what he did before. The very same strengths have brought about a tipping point into peripeteia, where now the pursuit of those strengths produces only disaster. There is this way in which, as a modern who attempts to recreate a medieval worldview, does their very best and brings all their strengths to bear, they instead push themselves further and further away from being a medieval, while at the same time thinking that they're approaching it. It's important to stress this because the degree of confusion, this is a multidimensional level of confusion. It's confusion about what's true. It's confusion about where meaning comes from. It's confusion about right and wrong. It's confusion about the consequences of our actions, about our own identity. It's like 8 different dimensions of confusion are involved in this kind of thing that happens when people try to cleave to the past and instead split themselves off from it. And all of that is in here, right? He's talking about millennialism. He's talking about the way that we interpret meaning. And of course, implicit in this, because he's going to set up his 3 epoch layout for looking at Western history, implicit in this is also how would the ancients have looked at the prospect of a millennium, differently from how the medievals did, differently from how moderns do. So all of that, I haven't even got into the full sentence. This is all in the opening phrase. And it's all really there. This is the way he's using language. And he knows that most people who read it aren't going to get it. And he's fine with that. This is one of the things that Donald White talks about sometimes, is that Kenneth knows that the readers are going to miss most of this, but he's just trying to make sure it's been said, so that at least he could come back and reread it and go, oh yeah, there it is. Or somebody else with the right background could come back and reread it, maybe for the second time after they've picked up more background, and find more things in the essay that they didn't see the first time. It's so that it acquires additional layers of meaning as you read it. Richard, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay, when you started mentioning the millennials at the beginning of in the 1990s, it reminds me a lot of James Watt, who was the Secretary of Interior during the Reagan administration. And I don't know if you're aware that he is the one who basically opened the floodgates and allowed mining and forestry to take place in the national parks and the reserves. And the reason why he did that is that he's a millennialist, and he believed that the world was going to end at the year 2000. So right. What's the use of maintaining these resources, because the world's going to end? And right. So when you were talking about the millennialists in the year 1000, yeah, they had a lot of, they might have written a lot, or they might have spoken a lot, but James Watt's decisions based off of his philosophy or his beliefs, had major repercussions for millions of people.
Yes. Yes. I'm glad you stressed that. You know, it's modernism. One of the things that he's going to talk about over and over in these essays is the way that although moderns believe they're the most objective, most accurate, most scientific people who have ever existed, in many ways we're the least. And part of the reason that we're the least is that we believe we're the most. Whenever you think that you're strong in an area, you stop trying to develop it the way you would if you thought you were weak in that area. And as a result, this is how hubris can protect a weakness and magnify it. You know, even the normal course of life, if we were neither overly proud nor overly embarrassed about some faculty, we would at least incidentally develop it. But if we think that's our best thing, then we say, okay, we're done with that. Let's focus on other areas. And we create a blind spot in ourselves. And so one of the blind spots that he talks about a lot is that we don't understand ourselves very well at all. And as part of that, we don't understand each other either. When Americans talk about Americans, they tend to slip into one of two modernist stereotypes. Either we're all pretty much the same, right? And politicians love this one. You see this all the time in populist speeches. Oh, as Americans, we blah, blah, blah. Whatever follows is based on the premise that we have a united culture, a united worldview. We're almost a mass mind. We're just one kind of person. But the alternative is equally modernist that we embrace, which is the idea that we're all precious snowflakes and no two are alike. And really there's no point in analyzing us because we're all just different. It's just infinite diversity and there's nothing to, what both of these have in common is they both prevent you from wanting to look at any kind of architecture or structure of human nature. Because either we're all the same and there's no point in, you know, whatever you know about yourself is true of everybody else, or we're all different and there is no pattern to it. And so there's no point looking at it. The idea that human character would develop into certain tracks, that would develop certain types of human character, and that it's not a random assortment and that we're not all the same either, but that it's worth studying and needs to be studied, is almost inexpressible from within either of these two stereotypical standpoints. They both defeat, you know, there are any desire we might have or curiosity we might have to look into this area. So as a result, it leaves us really vulnerable to being blindsided by the rise of fascism or by the rise of end times apocalyptists like James Watt. So as a result, a lot of Americans don't know that there are these millennial apocalyptic movements in the United States who are very devoted to trying to bring about the apocalypse. And because we're not paying attention and they are, you can find many of them at West Point. You can find a lot of them in the ranks of the military. They're attempting to get into places where they can push the button, because as soon as they push the button, Jesus will come back. And if you think I'm exaggerating, they say this is what they're doing. They're really straightforward about it. You can find videos about it. It's all over the internet. But because we know that there can't be types of character, because we know that we're either all the same or we're all different, and really it's not worth looking at. It's hard for us as moderns to keep track of the idea that there are maybe threads of subcultures within the culture that we really need to study and pay attention to. And that if we don't pay attention to them, we're gonna be screwed, right? You know, it's like when fascists started marching in the streets with tiki torches and swastikas, an enormous number of Americans, their jaws dropped, because they just assumed there wouldn't be a movement like that today. If there were, they thought they would know about it. And yet they thought they would know about it without looking into it. They thought it was just obvious. Same with the rise of open racism again. So there is this way in which our conception of human character keeps leading us as moderns to not study the very thing we ought to be paying the most attention to. I mean, at Delphi, what was the first piece of advice? You couldn't even get in to see the oracle at Delphi unless you walked past the pillar on which was inscribed, "Know thyself." And of all the things that the gods could recommend to us, why would they tell us to know ourselves? Well, because we don't, right? They're trying to tell us that human nature has a kind of trap where we become blind to ourselves. And once we're blind to ourselves, we become blind to all kinds of other things. But as moderns, we believe we are born into a state of enlightenment about ourselves. We have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And not listed there, but implicit in it, is that we have an inalienable right to be modern, which means to see the world more objectively than anyone ever has, which means we must know ourselves right out of the womb. It just must come for free. It's not something we have to struggle for all life long. It's not an area that's going to be the major source of tragedy in our lives because of our failure to understand ourselves and our relationships with each other. No, we just get it for free without working for it, like freedom. And so there are these ways in which there are these paradoxes that translate into a form of know-nothingism that are built right into the orthodoxy of modernism. And it crops up over and over in our lives, like why we didn't see James Watt coming, why we weren't able to stop James Watt from, just trashing all kinds of national resources in what he believed to be a fire sale before, in a few years he figured it was all going to be over. So why not? And we couldn't even conceive of this. So thanks for bringing it up, Richard. It's really important, and it goes right to the center of what this book is about. Sharon, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
So I thought that the first paragraph of this essay was very, very potent. And it led me to go and reread one of the editorials in my medical journals, which was written in October the 8th, 1921. They republished that. And the title of the editorial is called The Spirit of Revolt. But one sentence or a couple of sentences stood out to me. And they're talking about essentially the same thing that Kenneth Smith is talking about. And the author says, man has become a tender of machines,
yes,
rather than a constructive thinker.
Yes.
The increase in potential of human power has not been accompanied by a corresponding increase in the potential of human character. There you go again, know thyself. And at the end it says, whether the human protoplasm and the sensitive cells of the brain will be competent to withstand the strain of this process is a serious question.
Yeah.
And I thought that was pretty profound, and even more profound because this was written in October the 8th, 1921.
Right. Right. Yeah, that period, right at the end of World War I, was incredibly fertile. There was, it was a dash of cold water in the face of the orthodoxy and ideology of progress. Many people said, how can there be progress if we just squandered an entire generation in a futile war in Europe over reasons that everyone was, even by the end of the war, not entirely clear why any of this happened. It's a little obscured now because we renamed Armistice Day. But at the time, Armistice Day was a celebration of the end of the war and a time for sober reflection on how the hell did this happen? They wanted every year for people to sit back and go, Jesus, there's something wrong with us. We need to figure out what it is and see if we can fix it. But that didn't square well with kind of the patriotic aspirations of Americans and other kind of modern colonial nations. And so they renamed Armistice Day and turned it into something else to try to say, let's stop thinking about what might be wrong with us and what a disaster World War I was. Let's think about other things. Let's move on. No more to see there. But Paul Valéry, one of Kenneth Smith's famous writers, was writing right around that time and wrote incredible essays questioning the nature of modern progress. Now, if it's so great, how did we just do what we did? People were beginning to question at a really deep level some of the core assumptions of modernism. It was a moment of waking up, which sadly was quickly put to bed. Joseph and then Phil. Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, just to build on what that paragraph as well, is that seems to be this idea that just because we make scientific progress, that we actually make progress in wisdom, and that's right. Just not true.
Right.
There's no correlation between the two, and there's no correlation between that and actually, as far as not only wisdom, but the now it went in and out of my head actually what I was about to say, so I forget what I was about to. I lost it. But this idea of scientific progress. And this idea of knowing what to do with that scientific progress, and also coming into we're becoming machines. The idea of becoming machines itself is also problematic within that process. Sometimes when you start to make progress, quote unquote progress, it's mechanistic progress, and in that you kind of lose yourself, and you lose your ability to think and act wisely. So because you start to think only within the constructs of whatever it is that's been created in order to make us more efficient. So I just thought that was an interesting point, is that yes, there is no correlation between scientific progress and wisdom, and that survivability and that wisdom is something that I think moderns discount. Is that, you know, as a matter of survivability, that wisdom evolved and to begin with, you know, things like ethics. And so by throwing everything out and thinking that, you know, that we have a new rational way of seeing the world, that's not necessarily something that is, you know, going to lead to a better outcome. Right. And so, you know, that any better of an outcome that, you know, our ancestors had to deal with. So that's just interesting to think about.
Yeah,
that's the main.
Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I first have to say, once again, I misread the wrong thing. I read fugitive images, but I'm maybe that's my way of knowing, because I'm always confused. But I think the discussion so far led me to have my own understanding. I remember when I was younger, you know, when I first began teaching, I was interested in the blind spot. I mentioned that before, but I'll say it more carefully this time. And you know, the blind spot, if you hold it, you know, at arm's length, it's about the size of 50-cent piece.
Right.
And I was interested finding out, because obviously I don't see holes that big in my vision. So I did this experiment myself. And of course, if I held the blind spot over, if I put a black dot in on a piece of paper and I held the cover up the blind spot, it becomes white. If I put it on newsprint, it becomes look like type, right? Yeah. And if I put it on a red surface, it looks red. So I right away realized there was something going on that, in a sense, camouflage. I think it was a difference between sensing and knowing. And so I did one particular one in which I did a kind of ramp down of dots. You know, they're all smaller than the blind spot. So, you know, so you wouldn't say, well, that's because you could see it beyond the size of a blind spot. Right, and I ramped down from larger to smaller. And I think I made 5 dots in a perfectly ramped down shape. And of course, in the middle one, it was blank. Okay. And I cover up the blind spot, and sure enough, I saw 5. No problem, you know. I would say on a stack of Bible, what I saw was 5. Okay, so I decided, well, I'll go one step further. I want to make sure I saw 5. So I start counting just to be sure that there was 5, right? Yeah. And I started from the large to small. I just got lost. I did it again. I got lost. I really couldn't actually say. So I started from the smaller end and go up. I got lost again. And you would think that, oh, you can't get lost out of counting 5. It's not like 52 and you just forgot, you know. So I knew right away that there's something wrong. I kept looking and looking. I kept getting lost. And then I tried over and over again until finally I got dizzy. In fact, I got nauseous. I had to give up. So right away, I understand that there was a schism between knowing and sensing.
Yes.
And I think that's where the problem is, because if you were to ask me, how many did you see? I could honestly say I saw 5. Okay. And even though I knew there's only 4, I would honestly say I saw 5. And if you took me in a lie detector test, I think I would pass it, because even though they might catch that, oh, you know, there's 4 and then 5. However, if you say, how many did you count?
Right.
It would be a very ambiguous answer.
I got lost.
I don't know for sure, and you know, like I would spill the beans, okay? Then I thought about, okay, in the ordinary world, that's okay because in experiential world, impressionist world, you experience what you experience, you go with it.
Yeah.
But if you were one of those two guys in the nuclear underground to press the button, then you have a problem, right?
Yeah.
You think you saw something, and then should you press the button now because you're sure that was 5?
Right.
And they said, well, wait a minute, wait, I'm not so sure after all. So who should you put in that decision, which is world ending, right?
Right.
Because if you put the guy who's in doubt, then that's a problem. But if you put the guy that overrides his doubt,
It's also a problem.
even worse.
Right.
Right? I know there was 5. Let's push the button. Right.
Right.
So you left in this sort of schism about questioning yourself about what is it you actually know.
Right.
And I think that was a very important experiment I did personally. I mean, I didn't analyze it to that degree, but I knew there was something, and I knew that either my mind or my eyes was lying to me.
Right.
And so knowing that schism, that I was much more cautious. I think that was maybe sort of, well, I think I began before that, but it certainly hardened my feeling about trying to equivocate between knowing and sensing.
Yeah.
Because I knew that, somewhere in between, I definitely saw 5, no problem. And like, well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think that's what we're living in. I think that is an internal problem with human beings. And so we've constructed this thing of, let's say, push the button if you saw 5.
Right.
And I am just not so sure. So that's connected to this, even though I'm lost. But nonetheless, I thought I'd contribute to it.
Thank you, Phil. Richard, go ahead.
I was just going to say that listening to Phil's comments about the people in the bunker reminds me of the movie Failsafe, where a teletype machine does not work properly and they get wrong instructions. And these people are segregated from the rest of the world. They're only, the only way that they communicate with the outside is through telephone and through this teletype, and they opt for the teletype. And so they get a message through the teletype, it's wrong, and they construct a completely wrong world out of it. Quite amazing.
Right.
And so it is interesting that, as he was talking about the dots, I was immediately thinking of optical illusions or pop art, and how we can't trust our senses. You simply cannot. Or, a person who's drunk, or a person who is high. They, for all intents and purposes, believe what they're seeing or thinking is the truth. And obviously it is moderated by drugs or by chemicals.
Yeah, the challenge of epistemology, given the nature of the human mind and how it structures, is an enormous challenge. And in some ways, what distinguishes the two kind of infantilized basal metabolic character types from an adult character type is that they don't want to deal with that. They want to feel confident. They want to feel sure. They want to obey the law of the excluded middle and believe that when they know something, they know something, and when they don't know something, they don't know something, and that's just the way it is. What they don't want is to be stuck and uncertain about whether they know or don't know. And that's a problem, because as finite creatures attempting to represent an infinite universe, it automatically creates paradoxes. The correct, proper relationship in epistemology for a human being is to recognize that our perspectives are going to be rife with paradoxes, and that dealing with them and sometimes slowing down and finding out, well, okay, why is there a paradox here? And what could it mean? Even though it's embarrassing, even though it makes you feel like a child to give up that false certainty, that false pride that you know what's what, it's actually the only path toward an adult, mature relationship to the truth. So that you want is a culture that rewards you for pausing and investigating at moments like that, not a culture that punishes you and says, ha ha, that guy beat you to the answer, so he gets an A and you flunk. You know, the winner loser thing drives people out of that capacity to stand with a foot in both worlds, or as Phil says, to stand at the gate of the city and look in and look out and go, how do I reconcile the two perspectives I'm seeing? Sharon and then MJ. Go ahead, Sharon.
I'm having a lot of difficulty with that. Knowing and sensing and reconciliation and make a decision. And you can help me with this, Rick, probably because I come from a world where if you see something because you know it, you must act on it. The time for decision is you trust yourself, you know yourself, you do it because the consequences of inaction are so high. Yes. And when we have big national decisions on the political level, we just saw the actions of General Milley when he thought he had a president that was kind of nuts. He called in the team and he said, let's do this together, right? And so when we have big decisions, it takes more than one mind. When I'm in the operating room and I can't figure something out, I call one of my colleagues, come on in.
Right.
So to get another mind. So there is an outcome from unity and multiplicity, which helps us with those uncertain decisions. Because to stand around in wet pants and wonder what you're going to do just doesn't help our progress move along. And probably it's my mindset that makes me see it that way. So you can help me with that.
Well, these two things aren't opposites, right? Because what's happening is that you're acting by bringing in more perspectives.
Yes.
But you wouldn't have taken that action if you hadn't realized that there was this moment of uncertainty. Many people are taught to suppress that moment of uncertainty, so they would never call in the additional perspectives. They would just act on what they thought to be true. They would just pick one and go. Whereas you've been trained that when you hit those moments, you bring in the extra perspectives you need in order to reconcile the situation. In other words, you're not suppressing the uncertainty, you're using it in a way that allows you to overcome the problem.
Is there any time when cultures actually do that? When cultures actually examine themselves and go forward? Or are we always stuck in this uncertainty and indecision, of which the outcome is questionable?
Well, the way that moderns suppress that moment, except in medicine and except in certain other situations, the way that they suppress it is to say, if you even acknowledge the uncertainty, you'll be paralyzed forever. It's a trap. Don't go that way. It's a slippery slope. So just always be confident, just always charge ahead and everything will work out. So what's happening is that in this conversation, you're actually doing the contra-modern thing. You're actually paying attention to the uncertainty and then wielding it as a tool to change your behavior. And in this case, the behavior is to bring in the additional perspectives so that you can get more angles on the problem. But many people in many industries in modernism, when they get that moment of uncertainty, they just suppress it. They don't act on it. What you don't see is you don't actually generally see people just pause there and be paralyzed for life. We just don't generally do that. But we're always afraid that it's going to happen all the time. And that's why most people suppress it completely. They're terrified of the uncertainty. They think that it leads to impotence and ineffectiveness, and they'll get a bad grade because in class they were punished if they didn't raise their hand quickly enough. So they've learned to just ignore the pause. Now that's a modernist thing. That particular approach to dealing with uncertainty is very modernist. In the medieval world, people would deal with uncertainty all the time because the science wasn't nearly as developed on the one hand. But on the other hand, because human beings weren't the source of meaning, my ego wasn't the source of meaning, God was the source of meaning. People could always legitimately pause and say, you know what, I think I'm looking at some mystery of God here. And it's okay to slow down because we're merely mortal, and how can we be expected to know all these things? There was a built-in safety mechanism that went side by side with the dogma that allowed, under the medieval mind, for a greater comfort with uncertainty than we have as moderns. We have the great march of progress that must steadily just never stop in its beat and just keep going. And in the ancient world, there was a lot more tolerance of uncertainty, because, again, partially because the science was less developed, but partially because even their approach to religion involved a lot more uncertainty. I'm always struck by the way that in the medieval world, if you're a medieval and you see somebody else has a different religion, it's your job to either kill them or convert them. Like right away, you must commit genocide. It's God's commandment that there should only be one religion, and it's yours, and you must exterminate all the others. But in the ancient world, if you ran into somebody with a different religion, it was a polytheistic situation. There were more than one God, and built into these polytheistic religions was the idea that we don't know who all the gods are, and that it's important to learn about the gods because they teach us things about nature. And so any God that somebody else knows about that you don't know about might be some major hole in your life strategy. You've got to find out what they know that you don't know. And it's why the Greeks were constantly expanding their pantheon. It's why the Romans were constantly expanding their pantheon. They had this idea that the world is full of unknowns and mysteries, and that you should go figure them out and engage with them. So the relationship to uncertainty was very proactive in the ancient world, tolerated in the medieval world, and in the modern world, we try to stamp it out and get ourselves down to things that are true and not true, and that's all there is.
So before you go from me, I just want to come back to the text where Kenneth Smith says, but these diverse optics,
yes,
and I think that's what we're talking about, can be sorted out. Each lens system with its own historical origin and its internal logic, however much it disrupts and is disrupted by others. So I find that all very positive and actionable.
That's right. That's right. He's what he's giving us here is not dithering, but ironically, and it would kill him to hear me say this, he's giving us a pragmatic kind of philosophy. He's saying, the reason for studying these things is not, something to pass the time or because I feel like dithering, but because the more of this we understand, the more we'll be able to comprehend why we have the fractures in our worldview we do, and help us figure out what to do about them. Whenever we get stuck on one of those split perspectives, we'll actually have actions we can take to resolve them. Whereas if we don't know that our mind is full of these fragments from different epochs, we won't have any way to understand or reconcile the schisms that they're giving us. We won't, because we're barely even willing to acknowledge there is a schism. There's this whole denial thing that's going on in modernism where we don't want to admit that there's all these fractures in our minds. And as long as we stay in that state of denial, we can't actually resolve the fractures. All we can do is try to suppress them or deny afterwards that they happened. But if we acknowledge that it's going on, then it basically lays us out a possible life strategy for how to make our minds more coherent, and in the meantime, how to resolve these discrepancies when we find them. So you're right, Sharon, that he's building that in, and it's central to this entire book.
Mm-hmm.
MJ and then Phil. Go ahead, MJ.
Okay, just to build on what Sharon was talking about, I see two ways people deal with people are affected by modernism, and the first one is they have this need for judgment. They're happier with judgment. We've made a decision, and the other alternative is there are options on the table. Now, our modernistic society encourages us, fuels us, rewards us massively for the judgment side. I'm not even going to touch, the fact that if you fall into the judgment camp, the effort to evaluate options, especially as we in the moderns say, not just diversity of thought, but we pay lip service. We want you to think outside the box, but not too far out, because
right.
I got to think about that. And I just want to say, I was an economics major. I see things as allocation of scarce resources.
Yes.
Time. We are so obsessed with time. We love to brag. We don't have time to do all this stuff.
Yes.
And I'm going to shut up on my tangent, but that was my tangent, that the judgments versus the effort, the time, the resources needed to have a complete view of the situation.
Yeah.
We in the millennials are, as you say, rewarding ourselves for keeping our blind spots.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, MJ. Yeah. What we're gonna find is that what's interesting about the approach that he's taking in this book is that things that feel like tangents may turn out to be right central to the whole problem. And so what you're talking about, that culture of busyness, for example, oh, I don't have time for philosophy because I have to make money. I have to go. So it is not a coincidence, says Kenneth Smith, that we feel that way. We feel that way because the society puts enormous pressure on us to produce. And that pressure helps to prevent us from stopping and reflecting on whether we ought to be producing. Is this even a good thing to produce? Should we be doing something else? Well, I got to pay my bills right now. Now the cop's pulling me over for having sped. And there's constant barrage of pressures that say, don't think, don't reflect, don't take a step back, just take the easy route forward. The reason for the pressure, the reason for the busyness is that when we are rushed, we will always take the easy path because we don't have time to figure out the hard paths. And the easy paths have all been pre-formatted for us in order to make us comply. This is how modernism works. It's how it keeps itself together. You know, we like to imagine that previous epochs were just some version of ourselves, but we didn't have an industrial revolution in the medieval era or in the ancient era. For all the cleverness, for all the things that they did, there was no sense of the entire world being brought into a giant great machine. And there was no capacity as a result to mass format everybody's minds so that everybody had the same easy routes that they would lean towards. So as a result, the medieval and ancient epochs couldn't create a world in which by pressuring us enough, we would all do more or less the same thing. If in the medieval world, if they could somehow pressure everybody, they would have haired off in every which way. I mean, the Catholic Church in the medieval epoch was endlessly fighting heresies. There was just sprouting heresies everywhere they looked. Every time that they tried to clamp down, more heresies sprung up. It was the opposite of the problem we have under modernism, where when you clamp down on people, they all align and march in a row, right? We've got this thing where our instincts have been aligned that they couldn't do. It's the same in the ancient world. The polytheistic worldview to start with really didn't reward the idea of somehow getting everybody to march in the same direction. It just was inconceivable. You needed monotheism to propose the idea that there is one source of meaning in one direction that we should all follow before you could even set up the program of modernism, where all of our easy paths would point the same direction. So there's a way in which things that we take for granted under modernism as being human nature are actually artificially created within us by industrial culture. And we can't see it mainly because we don't look at the previous epochs in their own terms to see that they behave differently. So what he's trying to do in this book is pretty radical. He's trying to get us to the point where we can look at two other epochs, not in our terms, but in their own terms, in order to compel us to be able to get perspective on who we are and see the things that we take for granted as human nature that are nothing of the sort, but that have been manufactured for us in the modern epoch. Phil, then Marianne, then Paul, then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'm a wee bit upset by the conclusion that some people say, you know, that the difference between sensing and knowing is that you can't trust your senses. That's correct. That's correct. But it's also correct the other way. You can't trust your knowing,
Right.
which is the other part that's correct. I think what happened is that it is really the problem of the mind. You know, the reason why we don't see the blind spot is because the mind itself wants to construct wholeness, a unity for us to act, even though there are holes in our way of seeing and thinking. And so if you're a primitive man, hunter-gatherer, you think you see something that may be a lion, you have to take action. So action, praxis, and also thinking is also important because you got to get the hell out of there, right? Let's make sure, get the hell out of there. But we have constructed such a synthetic culture that separated that it became more and more mandatory to, in a sense, obey the rules of knowing. And so therefore, in a sense, it's almost as if understanding the rules, understanding the structure has become more so dominant that it's become overtake reason in a way. So reason should tell understanding that these are only the rules, okay? But understanding has subverted that to a degree. We have to understand. I remember making how the grayscale, the senses actually accentuate the differences. You know, if you have a gray next to a lighter gray, right before the division, right at the division, the dark part actually gets darker and the light part gets lighter, because that's actually functional. It sort of makes sense, because if in a dark place, you want to accentuate that so that you don't miss your step.
Right.
But that's an advantage that works for you. But it also traps you into a structure. I think more and more so that feedback loop of being in the structure is important. As an example, like our modern economy depends so much in the supply chain, right? And we have developed now efficiency, which actually even overrides understanding, because the one understanding provides efficiency. Efficiency is many times inefficient because it doesn't have enough, adaptability to take into falling out of it. An example, one damn ship in the Suez Canal.
Yes.
One damn ship.
Yes.
One flaw in the efficiency system that we depend on, you could just forget about, let's say, the concept of the moment. What is it? The moment that happens, you have to have efficient work, so you depend on that structure. That
Yes.
blocks all sorts of things. And COVID has destroyed the just in time. Just in time. That's the one I want to say. Just in time moment is necessary because that's so efficient. Because if you want to not play just in time, you have to have warehouses. What a waste of money and time, right? But we don't have enough adaptation now that once one ship broke and once COVID hit,
Yes.
and there is like people are not going to work, just in time is out of it. You're out of time. It's going to take you months, possibly years to actually recover from that. And we have disobeyed the law of, let's say, storing grain at the fat years so that we could get through the lean years, right?
Right.
So in some sense, efficiency is good, but only to a point.
Right.
Right?
It has
if
to be
you
balanced.
go beyond a certain point, then you are going to suffer, going to extend. So saving time ends up losing time.
Yes.
So therefore, you have to build in a dual structure that pays attention to just in time, right? Because there are so many links in the chain of this delivery chain that one trucker not showing up destroys that. So not only the ship, the truck, the operator to put the thing in, every one of those links breaks down, and then suddenly the whole system breaks down, rather than just like one little tiny thing. Okay, we could just bypass that, but in some sense you can't, and particularly if everything depends on one ship rocking up the Suez Canal. I couldn't believe it, so
it was a big eye opener, wasn't it?
Exactly. So you have to think in terms of the unity of the system also has its faults.
Right. Thank you, Phil. Marianne, then Paul, then Sharon, then Richard. Go ahead, Marianne.
I've read this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it talks about two minds. And the automatic mind has a built-in cultural bias. So what we have anchored in the past always comes up. And so the quick response is not necessarily a response that's thought through. And I think that we have a tendency to think of our minds as rational. And they did studies with people with stroke victims. And really the left brain has a tendency just to fill in the blanks, to create a story that we could try to understand and not be challenged by it.
Yeah.
I also think that the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg is really important, because you have to have that moment of silence to accept that there might be something else, some other answer could be out there, and to have that silence bring you what Phil was talking about, the unity, like to bring you, rather than the cultural biases of a quick response. And to Sharon, I would say that, you know, the robots in surgery have no uncertainty. So good for her.
They do a poor job, very poor job. Can I tell you? They take twice as long. Let me tell you, don't go there, Marianne. I've been there with them.
Thanks, Marianne. Paul, then Sharon, then Richard. Go ahead, Paul. Oh, are you still there, Paul? Oh, I think he stepped away, so we'll come back to him. Sharon, then Richard. Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I take off something that of what you said and something that what Phil said. You said they had to, and you could please help me if I got the interpretation wrong. You said they had to come down to a single system, monotheism, before they could not ensure, but see any kind of order. And I want to go back to the text here, where the ancient worldview is naturalist, physiocratic.
Yes.
And I am very enamored by the word, right? Because this is going to dovetail into what Phil was saying. The physiocratic is an economic theory, and maybe MJ could help me with this. And the economic theory was built on the circulatory system of the body, where that he believed that land and labor was the lifeblood of the economy, and that whatever was produced by land and labor circulated through the economy and created wealth, right? So now, having studied physiology, if your heart fails, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
Everything else is gone. If your kidneys fail, till you get on an external source for both things, you're out of luck. And I think this is the way the society has built systems. What we have not done is build any backup. I look at the ports, all the ships in the ports, and I was watching a commentary yesterday. And it's not so much that we don't have any truck drivers or any trucks to get the product off the port, is that we've changed our habits. We've ordered so much in the pandemic that so much merchandise is coming in that the system is overwhelmed with all this product, right? So what we didn't have is a backup. So when your heart fails, if you're lucky enough, we can put you on the heart-lung machine, right? But each system is interdependent. And I think this is the way our society is.
Right.
And that's the level of, and that manifests itself as efficiency or inefficiency.
Yeah, the exact same thing that can be efficient in one way, in the maximum, efficiency, can be maximally inefficient in another way. There is this, again, paradoxical quality to the human life when we interact with things. So an example of this is that if you want to be maximally enduring, you create a lot of backup. You create a lot of redundancy. For example, a critique of Western civilization and why medieval Europe survived through invasion after invasion after invasion from the steppes of Asia is that it was decentralized. There was no point where if you just took out that one point, you could topple all of medieval Europe. You had to stop all of it. You had to literally cover the whole thing in order to stamp it out. If there was even one monastery left, they could rebuild the whole monastery system from there for their culture. And as a result, it really illustrated something that we also see in biology, which is living organisms that have highly redundant systems are very tough to kill. Whereas organisms that are extremely integrated, that have a whole bunch of centralized points of different kinds of control, you take out even one of those points of control and you take out the whole organism, because it's overly integrated and lacks redundancy. So, this goes to that warehouse issue. If you have warehouses all over the place stocked up with product and the current ship doesn't come in, that's okay. You've still got backup you can draw from all those warehouses. The system has multiple points of redundancy. It doesn't have a single point of failure. And so in that sense, it's a more efficient system because it's able to survive hard times better. However, if you want to get rich quick, the easiest way to get rich quick is with a scam, with crime, especially big crime. And so one of the ways to do that is to hollow out all your systems and to sell off all those assets. You create a fire sale, and just for a moment, you drive stock prices through the roof because you have this massive wealth that you've generated. Then what you do is you jump ship, and the corporation collapses behind you the first time an emergency comes along because they have no backup anymore. There's no redundancy. It's a house of cards that can't sustain even a brief wind. In the industries that I've worked in, I've seen this happen over and over, where you get these con artists who come in, they scam the system, they drive up stock prices in order to get themselves a golden parachute, and then they jump out before the bill comes due, before the first time that the hollowed out system fails to survive. One of the things that's curious about modernism is that because everything doesn't come down to the truth of nature, because it doesn't come down to the truth of God in a medieval perspective, because it comes down to the truth of the numbers, and the numbers can be added up in the spreadsheet in different ways depending on your objective, it's very easy to make a scam look like wisdom, long enough to pull the scam off and then get out before people clue in and figure out there was something wrong with the spreadsheets. So this thing about what counts as efficient and what counts as inefficient, it all comes down to goals and meaning. And goals and meaning are the great blind spot of modernism. Modernism is based on the precept that we don't have to agree about those things. We'll just focus on pragmatic issues like how to make a bunch of money. And so we do that, but sometimes at the cost of destroying everything. Richard and then Paul. Go ahead, Richard.
Oh, Paul's first.
Oh yeah, that's right, Paul. Sorry, stepped away for a moment. So go ahead. You want to come off mute there?
Okay, so I apologize because I had to take it because it's Monday afternoon, I still have to work. Anyway, the only thing I wanted to ask, Rick, when I came back, last time you mentioned that you will be talking about change from slave societies from why Rome was overrun by the barbaros, why we changed from one slave society to feudalism. Because that's what I have in my mind for many years, and I'm not understanding 100% why it happened and how it happened. I do understand 100% very well how it happened from feudalism to capitalism, but that's the only thing what I was interested in because I appreciate your knowledge about history. It's excellent. I don't agree with you on many opinions, but I appreciate your knowledge, so if you can help me with that. That's why I came back. Sure.
So that's going to be a recurring theme over the next 6 months while we go over this book. He's going to talk about the ancient world. He's going to talk about the medieval world, and in that, it's going to become clear how the transition happened. He's going to talk through not just the nuts and bolts of what happened, but why did it happen the way that it did? How did the ancients look at the world and at human relationships economically, and how did that set up the possibility of the medieval revolution? Why did the medieval revolution develop out of that as a natural product, and why did it revolt the way that it did? And then I think the real kicker for me is how the exact same belief system that could be so powerful and creative while it was in revolt against the ancient world order, so that it had two different schemes in mind. It had the ancient scheme and its new scheme, how it became an enormous problem once the ancient world was defeated. And so it was reduced from being two mental worldviews to being a single worldview. All kinds of problems arose in medievalism after they won against the ancient world. And that applies to feudalism as well. The manorial system of how serfs worked and lived was revolutionary when it was being set up against ancient slavery. When it was in opposition against the two and they had the tension between them, then it was this amazing alternative. But it became a trap after it was no longer pushing against what, the perceived evils of the ancient world, and it had to stand on its own 2 feet. It became an incomplete system that had been used to filling in the blanks in the ancient worldview and replacing broken things in the ancient worldview and relying on the ancient worldview to supply the rest of the picture. So when the ancient worldview fell away, those pieces of the picture fell away too, and we were left with certain vacancies in the way they thought about meaning, in the way that they did their economic and political relationships. Same thing happened in the modern world. There's a reason why science doesn't engage with issues of religion, with ethics, why it doesn't, engage as much with human nature and culture and sociology as it should. And that's because it grew up inside the medieval world order, where the church provided all that stuff. And so science was like, well, the only way we don't get burned at the stake is we agree to a division of labor. The church will supply all the meaning, and we'll fill in all the know-how for, how to fire, how to lob shells at our neighbor, and how to sink a ship and so forth. But as soon as the medieval worldview fell away, then nobody was supplying answers to the questions of meaning and where does knowledge come from, and truth and so forth. And meaning, science just kept on going the way that it had been before, focusing on the things that it agreed to focus on. This is a recreation in the scientific world of what happened in the medieval world when it pushed away against the ancients. It too was originally a whole system that was designed to have a complement, but when the complement fell away, then suddenly its own deficiencies became major issues instead of being little details. So, but this is something we're going to be talking through for weeks to come. There's not a short answer, I'm afraid. It takes some discussion to get into. But it is something we're going to be talking about over and over and over. Everything in this book is designed to help make those transitions clear, to bring them into focus. So we'll,
Thank you. I will try.
Sure. Richard and then Steve. Go ahead, Richard.
Okay. 2 things, a little bit divergent from one another. To add on to what Phil was saying earlier about supply chains and so forth, I remember I was waiting at the airport in Baku, Azerbaijan once, and I met some people who were there from the CDC, and they were talking about supply chains, particularly for refrigerated goods, because if you have something that's made in a factory and it's carefully controlled temperatures and so forth, the minute it leaves the factory, it's got to be in a truck that's controlled. Then it's got to be put in a warehouse that's controlled. Then it's got to be in another truck that's controlled. Then it has to go to wherever it's going, let's say a hospital, and it has to be temperature controlled. Anywhere along the line, if the temperature goes above a certain, your product is crap. It's no longer usable. And so our lives have become much more complicated over the time because of all this, not just in time, but because we have to have this control of the supply chain,
right?
Which I thought was interesting. Going to the article and that one, the paragraph that we're on right now about the ancients. Yes. One of the things I noticed that was really interesting is he says nature is a dynamic order of existence that rules and runs on its own. And I'm thinking, oh, we have a feedback loop there. There's no conscious thought needed there. Then we say the genius of nature lies in its organic structure, the weave of parts into a whole. I was like, oh, we have emergence theory here. Again, no thought necessarily. Although he does trip up, and he says at the last line on that page, nature orchestrates the phases of things. It's like, nope, don't reify nature. It doesn't orchestrate crap. It just happens. But I thought it was interesting that he's talking about processes that emerge on their own and feedback on their own without any operant. There's no universal supreme mind that's controlling all of these things, versus in our little petty lives, everything has to be controlled by a mind or we fall apart quickly.
Yes. Yes. So let's unpack a little bit of this. You know, what he's doing in the ancient, medieval, and modern epochs is not trying to give you one correct perspective on all three epochs. He's not trying to put us into the position of being judges so that we can say who's right and who's wrong. Because he's trying to start by acknowledging that as mortals, we're always wrong. We're just dealing with varying levels of what kind of errors we have and how close to the truth we get. We're finite, the universe is infinite, and you know that's the problem we struggle with. So instead, our focus is on, can we recreate each of these worldviews in its own terms so that we don't think about the ancients, oh, you're wrong, nature doesn't work that way. But instead we think, if I were an ancient and I thought the world worked that way, what would I see when I looked at the problem that I'm trying to look at? Versus if I were a medieval and I looked at the world from a medieval perspective and I look at that exact same problem, what would I see that was the same as an ancient? And what would I see that's different from an ancient? And why would those similarities and differences exist? Once we can do that, once we can read it without going, no, you're wrong about nature, it doesn't work that way. Once we can say, no, really, if I'm an ancient, that's how it looks to me, then we'll be able to turn both of those perspectives on the modern order and say how many of the things that we think are just inevitable and true are actually merely artifacts of a distinctively modernist way of looking at the world. So, for example, this issue about nature orchestrates the phases of things so that there's a seasonal cycle of growth and decline. You know, this is something any ancient could see. They could see that when you look out into the world, as winter comes, all the leaf-bearing trees shed their leaves. And in the spring, the converse happens. All of the bare trees begin to put forth leaves. What you don't see is you don't see a tree that's bare all through the spring, summer, and fall, and then puts out leaves at the end of the fall just in time for winter. Nobody does that. And there's a reason why nobody does that. Because nature, not through consciousness, not through design, but through its innate feedback loops, is creating a convergence in which things self-design themselves over time until they align with these greater patterns. And so as a result, you get a form of orchestration that doesn't require a director. It doesn't require a conductor. It's a self-orchestration. At this point, because our language is a modern language, words begin to fail us. We can't say it was designed this way, because that implies there's a designer, which is a medieval idea. And we can't say it knows to do this. There's a whole host of words that imply knowing, like orchestration. And we can't use any of them because nature is doing it without having to know that it's doing it. So in fact, it's very hard for us to represent the ancient perspective on this using any of the words available to us. He picks orchestrate just as a convenience, but he doesn't really mean there's a conductor up there. So he's kind of alluding to some of the same things that Darwin talks about when he says there is this curious phenomena where when species are when they exist within a certain ecosystem for a long enough period of time, they change generationally to align themselves with that ecosystem. And the results, regardless of how we got there, is a kind of orchestration. So that's what he means. And he's trying to say it not because he's saying that's what he thinks, but because he's trying to say, you can't understand the Greek perspective at all unless you know that they're looking at everything around them that way. They're looking at people that way, society, they look at the market that way, they look at politics that way, they look at the way we think that way, everything they see in terms of self-orchestration, convergence upon successful patterns within the larger ecosystem of nature. And part of where it becomes revolutionary is the idea that for a medieval, for example, this is inconceivable. For a medieval, nature cannot be a source of meaning. It cannot self-orchestrate. The whole thing has to have been set in motion by God and is basically kept going by miracle after miracle after miracle from God. And if God, even for an instant, didn't want it to happen, it would all just immediately stop. This idea that it is a product of a single designer, and not as an absentee God, but as a present God who's constantly making it happen, is core to the medieval worldview. And from the medieval worldview, therefore, nature can't self-orchestrate. It's not possible for it to self-orchestrate. The medieval worldview created this idea that nature is vacant of meaning. It has no intention, no understanding, no orchestration, no meaning. It has nothing. It's worthless dross. It's dust, ashes. And only God grants it through his grace. He grants it life. And at all times, he preserves it from falling back into the abyss through his love and devotion. This perspective is different from the modernist perspective. When the moderns overthrew God, they didn't replace God as a source of meaning. And so what we're left with is a nature that means nothing. And it can't teach us anything. It's just a larder and a toolkit waiting for us with our brilliant minds to go forth and do what we want with it. Because there's nothing that we could do with it that would be wrong, because there's not God to tell us that it's wrong, and nature can't tell us it's wrong. It's all basically meaningless, waiting for us to assign whatever meaning pleases us to it. And so it's very hard for a modern to look at nature the way an ancient did and see it as this miracle of self-orchestration, because we learned from the medieval world that we rebelled against that it means nothing. It's useless. It's just a machine. And if it's just a machine and we're in it, then we're just machines, which means we're worthless and meaningless. So there is this nihilism, this abyss of meaning that spreads in modernism from the earliest days of the revolution against the medieval epoch, when they were still high on, we're overthrowing the corruption of the medieval era and we're making a brave new world. But over time, as modernism was able to work itself out more and more, we ended up in a position where people could look at other human beings and go, I can do whatever I want with them. They mean nothing. I can have death camps. I can have, mass slavery on a scale never seen before. I can do behaviorist experiments in which I put a child in a box. It doesn't matter. It's all just machines. This is modernism kind of arriving at its purest state, which is a direct consequence of what it rebelled against and how it rebelled against it, and what got left behind and what got taken forward when it separated itself from the medieval epoch. This is what Paul was talking about when he was saying, what do I have to say about these eras? The thing that I get out of Kenneth is this way in which each epoch thinks that it is its own thing and fails to understand the ways in which it is the direct consequence of its pushing away from the previous era, leaving it with certain characteristic holes that it takes forward and that become core to the definition of what it is. So that we can't understand what it is unless we know how it got here. This is what we see in medicine with embryogenesis. As we're looking now at cells and stem cells and the capacity to regrow neurons and bones and whatever we need to out of stem cells, we can't make any of that work unless we come to understand embryogenesis and what are the lines of cells that evolve from the original fertilized egg, and which ones have specialized too far and can't go back to that pluripotent state, and which ones can, which ones still preserve within them some capacity to differentiate into something new. This sense in which the possibilities of the future depend upon the character that we bring with us from the past. This is what's all throughout this book. This is why he's got us looking at these three epochs. He says the same is true of character, it's true of personality, it's true of communities, it's true of culture, it's true of civilizations. And if we apply it, we get some purchase and some ability to make meaningful change in the world. But if we don't, which modernism encourages us not to do, then we find ourselves sort of trapped in an eternal present in which we don't really have any purchase and can't seem to make things work. Stephen, then Phil, then MJ, then Sharon, then Joseph. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just reading something this week from Stedman Jones. He wrote the enormous introduction to the popular edition of the Communist Manifesto.
Huh.
In one of the footnotes, it sort of confirms a suspicion I've always had, even though I'm not enormously well read. And that is the modernist concept of progress, although it did have a lot of antecedents, really came to flower in Lessing's Education of the Human Race.
Right.
And yeah, it was kind of, this might have been an observation of Bauer, that Hegel drew heavily. That was the thing which became the floor of many of his ideas, was Lessing's work. And I just thought that might be a curious angle, because I'm very suspicious of this devotion to progress.
Yes.
And everyone says, we are progress.
Yes.
The other fools aren't it? I don't know. I'm just an ape creature that fell out of a tree. And you've given me the matchsticks of progress. I'll probably only burn myself, but I wonder, this religiosity of progress. Progress
Yes.
must be good. Hegel says, oh yeah, sure, yeah, you'll smash a few things along the way, but in the long run, something greater will arise out of all the disasters. We can be confident in that. Actually, oddly enough, that was the shadow philosophy in the show Babylon 5. I'll find the link for that.
Right.
Okay.
No, I mean, you're right to put your finger on the issue of progress, because it's one of the things moderns can least stand to have questioned. We have an unerring faith in progress. And part of the reason why we have that unerring faith is it suggests there is a great arrow from the worse to the better. And it points to us because we're the most recent thing to come along. So we must be better than everything that came before. There's this self-flattery built deeply into this notion of progress. Interestingly, if you go back and look at earlier epochs, they did not share that idea of progress at all. The medievals didn't have that sense. They had the idea of a fall, right? Eden was as good as it could get, and we fell from that, right? That's not progress. That's going the wrong direction. And that we need God to save us from the disaster that we created is built into this conception of the medieval worldview. Likewise, in the ancient epoch, they were constantly discovering, well, let's just start with the Greeks, right? The Greeks had this idea that the great age of gods and heroes was in the past, the golden age, and now we're living in the Iron Age, which is a much inferior, reduced epoch. And that we have to strive to lift ourselves up to do better than what we would naturally do because of how we're falling away from greatness. But then then they stick in the dagger and they say, yeah, but even the age of heroes self-destructed, so it had problems too. So they're not even as willing as the medievals are to have a straight arrow pointing down, let alone up. They're like, there were problems then, but that was still generally better than what we have now. But if we just recreate what we had then, we'll collapse again. So somehow we have to do better than we're doing now, but also better than we did before in the better era, or else,
just a moral question. I'm wondering if this great Hegelian progress is true, that the greater progress will arise out of the disasters. Who are we going to throw under the juggernaut of progress?
Right, exactly.
Because we know that even by Hegel's position, a few graves are going to be created along the way. I'm just wondering who are going to be the graves. Who are the ones we're going to have to assassinate before we create the great Hegelian utopia?
Well, as a modernist European, surely Hegel thinks that who we're going to throw under the bus is people of color from other continents who are desperately in need of us to colonize them and run them and tell them what to do. And probably Hegel would say the ignorant in our own country, anybody not as educated as he is, should be thrown under the bus. And I mean, there is the 19th century, 18th century concepts of progress that are constructed in such a way in order to put a certain person on top and everybody else conveniently serving them. I would say Hegel is as vulnerable to that as any other writer of his epoch. If we strip all of that out of Hegel, if we critique Hegel and say, he's not any more of a savior than Marx or anybody else. He's a philosopher writing at a certain time and place, and some things he's going to see more clearly than others. Then what we're left with when we pull out that 19th century progress dross is the idea that in a healthy organism, during the stages of development, there is a kind of progress that happens in which the organism is teleologically driven to develop to a certain state of maturity. And if you have not yet developed to that state of maturity, and if nothing sabotages your progress, you're going to continue to unfold new order, moving towards that state. And it's easy to see why he would have embraced that side. But as the Greeks point out, everything that's mortal dies. So we don't only unfold order in order to reach a pinnacle in which we flourish, but we also continue to unfold order in order to eventually die. So, there's a way in which if we take in the whole physiocratic conception of the ancients and apply it to Hegel's dialectic, we can see that the dialectic can be productive but it can also be destructive, just like nature can be productive or destructive.
Mhm.
I want to just put a little word in here for
Please.
Monty Python and every sperm is sacred. That
Yes.
we're brought up with the idea that we're all going to succeed.
Right.
We're all going to, you know, reach that golden, rosy bungalow that modern civilization offers and be happy ever after. But mysteriously, within the Monty Python, they remind us of the humble sperm. Now, every little sperm has that desire to meet the egg, and how many of them are there that don't make it?
Almost
This
all
is
of them.
nature.
999,000.
Yes, right.
That's just in one ejaculation.
Right.
But you asked,
It's worse
so
than
in
that.
2, it's number 2, it's times 2.
That's
So,
right.
you
Most
know,
of it's gonna fail.
the medieval doctrine, the Christian doctrine was every sperm is sacred. But
Right.
we look at the harsh fact of nature, very few sperms make it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, each epoch makes sense to itself unless you look too closely. And if you look too closely, you discover it's even incoherent in its own terms. It cannot simultaneously be the case that, you know, every sperm is sacred and yet they almost all fail. Why would God design things that way? There's all kinds of questions from the medievalist perspective on God that don't hold water, even in terms of its own value system. And as moderns, we love to point out those inconsistencies in the medieval era because we consider it the Dark Ages and that we're the Enlightened period. What we don't like so much is to turn that same trick on ourselves and say, how many of the things that we think are self-evident and coherent actually fall apart when we apply these critiques to ourselves and our own worldviews? And progress, Stephen, you're absolutely right. It's a great big walking bullseye target waiting to have progress critiqued and say, really? Are we sure about this? And how are we defining progress? And why would we define it that way? Many of the concepts of modernism begin to unravel if we take Nietzsche's joyful culture criticism and apply it to modernism. Modernism starts to squirm and get uncomfortable. It's like, stop dancing, stop pointing out our problems. We're the best. Just that's the end of it. Let's stop talking about it. All right, Phil, then MJ, then Sharon, then Joseph. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, I want to point out that that General Electric appropriated Hegel in his coinage. Progress is our most important product.
Yes.
I mean, that really is an appropriation if I've ever seen it.
Yes.
But, you know, but on the other hand, I would say, though, even though modernism, in a way, is has a kind of diabolical thing, it does expose something, because you said, you know, like we rejected the medieval, but we did learn something from the medieval, right? That exposed our own humanity in a way, in a deep way.
Right.
It's like if God was the source of power and God falls, then the will to power is ultimately ours, and ours to fight. And of course, if you have within that the people who are, how should I say, the ones that want to exploit the system, then what you do is you build a system to exploit that will to power. And once power is the case, then you control the education system, you control the military, you control the production. And so therefore, in a sense, you could continually exploit the power, because what happened is that progress itself in a structured relationship to power is really about exploitation of others, right? But I think that's all out in the open for people to see if they're willing to see it, right? Mm-hmm. It's constantly so, because, you know, like by exploiting not only the minority people of the colonies within our system, you know, and even the people who are just mere workers, you're the one that really truly have the power, the source of what is really important, right? So no wonder we have currently even an issue with democracy, because now we want to subvert the system to maintain the power, right? As Stalin said, we are not afraid of people voting because we will control the counting.
Right.
Right? I mean, like, once you control the counting, go ahead and vote. No problem.
Right.
But
Right.
we will count. And isn't that what's happening in our own system itself, right? Because the problem is that you're not afraid of the differences because you know the blacks, they knew where they belong, and that was okay. It's suddenly when they realize that, no, they have power, that you really worry about. It's really the similarity that they understand now that it's about power. There's still many people who don't seem to understand this, and that's why even the presumed liberation of itself, which is democracy, which I actually believe in, is something that you could get out of this conundrum and actually share the power with other people, right? But as long as you knew where your place was, that's no problem, because you just fit right into the system. But as soon as you begin to want to be like us, that's a big problem, right? We will do everything to control the vote, the access to power, the educational system. As a matter of fact, you know, the way business is now thinking in terms of the supply chain is what they would call, instead of building more warehouses, it's called nearshoring.
Yeah.
Watch out, you know, the Caribbean. Watch out, Central America, because the nearshoring process will maintain the just-in-time system better than the long chain of from being broken down. So watch out for the nearshoring. It didn't say bring it back to America, which itself is also a problem, creates problem elsewhere. But nonetheless, nearshoring will be the mantra to maintain the power, because now we won't let the system break down. You know, we'll have enough warehousing to take care of the short term and the medium term. The nearshoring will continue to exploit. So that is their solution to the supply chain problem. So watch out.
Thanks, Phil. MJ, then Sharon, then Joseph. Go ahead, MJ.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand the theory of the three stages. So can I paraphrase it?
Please.
We have the ancients. All they have is nature. Nature at this point can serve as like the lowest common denominator for a worldview. The ancients invent it, it's available forever. And then along comes the medievals, and they would have access to nature, but they invented God. So they go up a step. And once they've invented God, they can no longer ever see nature as it was seen in that lowest common denominator viewpoint from the ancients. They have been corrupted. They have their view of nature, and they can never go back and see it as it was for the ancients. Same pattern repeats itself. The moderns come, whatever we have that we think,
Man.
there we go. Woman.
That'll be the next system.
Yes. So it's the same thing that, we have this. We certainly, for all we talk about being medieval, we truly do not have the word of the church and the supreme being God as the medieval. We don't have it in our lives as the medievals did. Same thing for us going back to that lowest common denominator. We think we do. I'm sure, if you have a nature worshiping group, but you're not doing, you know what thunder is.
Mm-hmm.
You know it's not the gods. So, and I think that this lack of respect, as we get it, for everything that went before us, if you're on the second or the third step, you have this lack of respect, and you feel that whatever your time of man, time of God, time of nature, provide you with the solutions. Hence our total hubris in looking at climate change.
Right.
I mean, so that's how I see it, is these steps. You go up the step, you get a new tool thing, you're corrupted, and you can no longer see the common denominators or the viewpoints of the prior stages.
Right. So you described it in a way that's a great march of progress, leading to us, and that's typically how moderns see this. But what Kenneth Smith does differently is he says, well, all three epochs had nature, God, and man. They all had them. But what they did is they arranged them differently in terms of priority. So in the ancient world, nature came first. As even Heraclitus just flat out says, the universe has always been here, and nobody created it, which is unthinkable from the medieval perspective. So they had the idea of nature, but they also had the idea of God. It's just to them, God was subservient to nature. So nature created the gods. The gods arose from within nature, just like we did. And that they also had man as a factor in this. But for them, man was at the bottom of the pecking order. We are subject to the gods, where the gods reflect, the primary principles of nature. And the gods are subject to nature as a whole, and nature is the preeminent thing. So what do the medievals do in the revolution? They overthrow nature and stick it at the bottom. So now nature means nothing. It just happens to be where the big story is happening. And the big story is about the fall from grace and the need for salvation. So God is on top. He's the source of all meaning and everything. And then under that is man, who, thanks to a little bit of grace from God, has the possibility of being saved, right? And then under that is nature, which is pointless. It's just where you do your work. So then along comes the moderns, and the moderns overthrow God. So now God's at the bottom. So the order now is man is in charge. Man will decide the economy. Man will decide the politics. Man will decide what things mean and what we should do in the world. We vote, or whoever has the power imposes it on others. Might makes right. Whatever, it doesn't matter. First comes man, and then both levels underneath are meaningless. We've now apotheosized man from a medieval perspective, in which we have a monotheistic system, in which there's the only God is humanity, and where that leaves nature is nature has no meaning, but it's a bunch of matter that's lying around that we could do something with. We could profit from it. If we can figure out how to manipulate it mechanically to get what we want, then great. But otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. It means whatever we choose for it to mean, which means it means nothing. And likewise, God has now been demoted to a fashion choice or a hobby. If you want to go to church every Sunday, the modern world doesn't mind, just like they don't mind if you want to go see a movie or if you join a book club. It's just something you choose to be doing because that's how you want to spend your time. But all three of them have nature, God, and man. They've just rearranged the precedence between them. And in rearranging the precedence between them, in order to make that work, they had to reconceive all three of them in terms of what they mean, how they relate to each other, and therefore, how should we know things, and how should we make decisions in the world, and what kind of society should we create? All of that flows out of this inversion and rearrangement. Whatever we look to for answers really shapes the kind of answers that we produce, and therefore the kind of behavior and cultures we create. This is kind of what he's getting at here with this. So I think Kenneth Smith would say, from a Hegelian perspective, we can see that this happens through an unfolding of order, that these are stages of development, right? And that there is a dialectic involved. But he wouldn't agree with Hegel's sort of naive 19th century progress ideology. He'd say there's no guarantee that this is a great march of progress leading anywhere good. It's understandable that we want to pat ourselves on the head by putting ourselves at the top, but there's really no promise that this is progress. It's some kind of development. And one of the, if we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, one of the open questions is, if we were a stable, healthy organism, if we were well adapted to the world, then we could have faith that through the processes of evolution and convergence, that our stages of development would be healthy stages in the same way that an embryo stages lead to adulthood. But we have no such guarantee that we're a successful species. You know, some species are around for hundreds of millions of years and are really stable and have figured out their place in the world. Other species are barely around for 1 million years because they're going through periods of great change when a species are evolving rapidly from one to another because of the pressures put upon them by changes in their ecosystems. We don't like to talk about those intermediate species very much, except maybe we call them failures, right? Because haha, we're the fittest because we're around and they're gone, so they must not be fit. But what they really are is unstable transitions to the next plateau of stability in evolution. They were what it took to get to a species that had staying power. They didn't have staying power, but they had to be there as a chain in evolution to get there. Looking backwards, not looking forwards, but looking backwards, you know, in response to the pressures. If you think about species from this perspective, we have no guarantee that Homo sapiens is a stable species. We could just be on a step to some species that is stable. And if that's the case, and we don't know if that's the case, but hypothetically, if that's the case, it would mean that evolution never finished baking us and it never will. Something else is gonna be baked out of us. And that thing will be able to have faith that its stages of historical development are sustainable and healthy and lead to some kind of maturity. But in our case, if it's true that we're a transitional species, then evolution hasn't had time to do that work with us, and our stages of development might lead to a dead end or off a cliff. We don't know. This is an example of a question that moderns should ask from a scientific perspective based on the theory of evolution, but we never, ever, ever do. We just don't, because we're sure we're the pinnacle of creation. We're sure we're a stable species. We're sure that whatever goes on through our history must be the working out of maturation leading to something good. And in that, what we see is the circular logic by which modernism constructs its own worldview in such a way to praise itself and to stop us from asking the questions that we really ought to be asking about whether this is such a good idea. Because if it's not a good idea, it's not at all clear what the answers are. Sharon and then Marianne. Go ahead, Sharon. Yeah, you're still on mute.
Yes, I got it now. I have a little different point of view, and I want to put it out here.
Please.
I think that instead of progress, I'd like to substitute the word change. Because the only thing constant about life is change.
Right.
Right. And I just listened to you about whether moderns should ask the question as to whether or not we are the final evolution in the cycle. For me, that's a rhetorical question.
It is.
Because we will never know. And because I'm so outcome oriented,
yes,
what are we going to do with that information?
Yes.
And coming back to the text.
Oh, I have an answer for that, by the way.
Excuse me?
I have an answer for that question, by the way.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, we could go to the text first, but I'll circle around afterwards.
Okay, because what I thought I saw in rereading this was the kind of links between the three different epochs that Kenneth Smith outlined. And yes. I think nature is not the lowest common denominator, it's the highest common denominator. Because you just talked about all the varying seasons, and there is an automaticity to nature, just as how there's an automaticity to human beings. And in fact, he said in the text again, citizen economies as well answer to this primal logic of nature, dictating that whatever cannot subsist on its own must perish. Right. Autonomy, autarkia, and I think we talked about this last week, or self-rule, and here we come back again, self-sufficiency amount to a value inscribed in natural existence.
Yes.
And that I thought was pretty powerful.
Yes.
Then we come into the medieval age, and I think we're from 1400 to 1450, where I think religion takes center stage. And then to the very bottom of the second page, what I think really makes the change is where he said, spirit is the novel Christian conception of a principle of freedom from nature and freedom over nature. The
Yes.
Greeks had conceived such a power of self-mastery, extremize a crete or excellent, and logos or reason as the cultivated privileges of an exceptional aristocratic personality type. And I think it's the medieval period is when the Greeks and Romans reviewed the culture, what had gone before. And then, so we now come into moderns, and the first sentence that Kenneth Smith says, the modern order defines its origination by a radically different modus, a way of arising and cohering that was neither natural nor divine.
Right.
And then he identified this Renaissance prophet, which was the Pico della Mirandola, which was my point of wonder last time. Why did he use this guy from the Renaissance to explain the moderns? Did he have such foresight? Right? And he contrived a new myth about the unique genesis of man. Instead of being formed by nature or made by God, man was given the distinctive privilege of being left unfinished. And he was empowered to be his own creator. So what I think I outlined here is a kind of a flow of the difference in thinking and operations as we go through the different epochs and the kind of links to them. So I want you to comment on that.
Yeah, once again, you put your finger right on the central structure of his argument. This is what he's saying here, that the easiest way to get some quick insights into these epochs is to understand that they only make sense in terms of each other, as reactions against each other, as developments out of each other. The central argument of medievalism makes the most sense when you're at the end of the ancient epoch and you're disgusted by the corruption, when you just can't stand anyone, when all of the defects of the ancient world order are at their most obvious, most conspicuous, most inescapable, when all of the propaganda and arguments that have been used to excuse them away fall flat because you just can't stand how bad Rome is. That's when it's the easiest to come up with the statement of the medieval order, because it's in reaction against how bad things were, that you can say, if people cannot get their shit together, what we really need is God, right? Because if people are endlessly corruptible, if you can point to even Marcus Aurelius, supposedly the most philosophical emperor who ever lived, and his son is Commodus, God help us. How can that father produce that son? How the promise of excellence, natural excellence that we're being offered under the ancient epoch, they had all the opportunity they needed to disprove it by showing just terrible example after terrible example. And so in disgust, you get people responding and going, well, if none of you can get your stuff together, then we should stop looking to human beings and their nature as the salvation for human beings. We should look to something uncorruptible and pure that can't be corrupted. And that's where we should go for our answers. And of course, the problem with it is the premise that you have unimpeded objective access to that source of uncorruptible purity and truth. And what instead the medievals put in place, trying to create that, was they put in place the church hierarchy, which was made of people, which are of course are corruptible, which therefore ends up sadly perfectly reconstructing the corruption of the late ancient epoch and the late medieval epoch. So there's a reason why Pico della Mirandola would be the one to respond, why it would be that point in history, because it's when the medieval epoch's promises had fallen not just flat, but so blatantly, obviously, irrefutably, inescapably, shamefully flat that somebody could come up with the clear statement of, well, if none of that's going to work, then our only option is to do this. And so Pico writes his manuscript, going, I don't see any other way out. And the reason it coheres and becomes a worldview that becomes an epoch is because everybody else looks at the same situation and says, we don't have any better answers than that either. That must be the answer, because at this point in history, it's impossible to see any other choices. The problems have become so inescapable and so all-consuming that it looks like there's only one way out of the labyrinth, and that must be phi on nature and phi on God. Let's just make up our own mind how to fix this problem. Let's just fix it directly. We'll just get together and we'll fix the problem. And of course, the problem that we can now see from late stage modernism is that all of the political and economic and other structures that were put in place under modernism in an attempt to carry out that program of having people just directly solve the problems that face us didn't take into account the fact that not everybody wants to solve the problems that face us. Some people want to profit off them. And the people who want to profit off them actually have an easier time getting in control of all of those systems, because the systems no longer contain any correctives against what happens if absolutely psychopathic people get in charge and decide that they want to run things for short-term gain and long-term destruction. That's the Achilles heel that was put in place by the people who followed the ideas of Pico della Mirandola. They made a great machine that they thought would be incorruptible. As the founding fathers of the US said, men are corruptible, so we want a nation of laws, not men. We're gonna have a constitution, and we're gonna have lots of lawyers. And as we know, nothing corrupt can come out of lots of lawyers. You know, you look back on that period in history and you think, oh, you sweet darlings, that you could have thought that was the salvation of the human race. With enough accountants and lawyers, we'll make a perfect world. And boy, did it not turn out that way. But you can see why, if in 1450 you're staring the corrupt church in the face that's saying, you can't question us because we speak for God, and that's why we want to pocket all your money. Buy indulgences from us so you don't go to hell. You can see why people would say, okay, a world machine has to be better than this. It has to be, because this is just so bad. So yeah, Sharon, you're right. These things, what he's saying is that they're linked together, not because he thinks it would make a nice theory if they were, and not because he wants to cherry pick the evidence in order to show a way in which you can imagine these three epochs being linked together. But rather, from a Hegelian perspective, he's trying to look at all the evidence that you could ever find anywhere and say, what does the preponderance of the evidence show us? And what it seems to show us is that these transitions from one epoch to another, even though there are changes over centuries and multiple points when you could try to pick, this is the date, no, this is the date, no, this is the date, when the transition happened, because there wasn't any one date. What you can do as a clear dividing line is see how the definition of the sources of meaning are fundamentally alien and radically antagonistic to each other. There is no way to reconcile the medieval sources of meaning with the ancient sources of meaning. They're in direct opposition at a fundamental level. At all three levels of meaning, they're in opposition. They can't be reconciled with each other. You can only have one or the other because they repel each other. And it's the same with the modernist revolution against the medieval world. At all three levels, man, God, nature, the conception of each one, it's not just that they've been arranged differently, but they've been reinterpreted in terms of that arrangement in such a way that they're completely radically incompatible with the medieval worldview. You can't confuse them with each other. They just don't fit together. They can't compromise together. There isn't a middle spot in between each other. It's a rupture in worldviews that's happening. And it's easier to see that rupture than it is to pick a date in history and say, well, this was the date when, you know, such and such happened, so maybe that's the end of the medieval era. No, maybe it's this date, maybe it's that date. What we find is that history is a continuum, but our conception of the world and humanity and God, that does have a rupture. And yet it may spread gradually and incompletely. And there may be shards of the medieval worldview trapped inside the modern worldview. There may be shards of the ancient worldview trapped inside the modern worldview. We may think using those shards and not even knowing that we're now we're thinking about this topic in a modern way, but then in the next breath, we're thinking about it in the medieval way. We may not even know all of that's happening. But once we see these tools, these worldviews, we can apply them and we can detect the shards. And we can start to explain our own incoherency. Why did we hop from one perspective to another and think that we were using a coherent worldview? Well, it's because we don't see what we're doing in the process of thinking.
In fact, he sums it up here. He says, meaning and implication are to moderns what we make of them. This is the last paragraph. Moderns inhabit an envelope of infinitely reverberating artificialities, games, languages, rules and roles that are of interest solely because we have willingly accepted their claim on our interest. And that, I think, summarizes what you just said. And that's in the last paragraph.
Yeah.
So we are still in an evolutionary phase, if you ask me.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. You know, that part of what has happened is that since the ancient epoch, neither the medieval nor the modern epoch sees nature as having any meaning. Either at best, it's just evidence of how great God is. And by the way, even on Facebook in the modern era, you can still see people share scientific stories or photographs of beautiful places, and a certain percentage of people will respond, "Isn't God great?" It's like they don't want to know why it happened or how it happened. They don't admire the time of day or the place. They don't admire the photographer, only God. So there's ways in which these shards of medievalism are still present in the modern epoch. But what's happening when they do that, every time they do that, what they're doing is turning away from the amazing organismic coordination of nature, that nature would produce such things and keep producing them over and over without somebody making it do it. It's just astonishing. But the medieval worldview can't recognize the miracle and wonder and beauty of that, because nature has to be worthless. And it's the same from the modernist perspective. When you get two people walking through a forest and one of them is going, "Oh my God, look at the moss, look at the trees, look at the ferns growing out of the trees. Look at how old this is. Look at that fallen log that new trees are growing out of. This is like a miracle all around us." But somebody else is walking through going, "Man, if we could just cut all this down, I could make a killing. I just, I wonder who owns this. How do I, this is a state park. Maybe I need to buy a legislator. If I buy a legislator, I can get this place decertified, and then I can be there to rush in and buy it, and then I can sell it off, and I could be a millionaire," right? This is a modern perspective on the exact same place that somebody else is walking through having an ancient reverie in. Because from the modern perspective, the forest has no value at all. It's not until you destroy the forest and create lumber that you have value, because the only value is money. Once it's money, then it has value as money. But the thing itself has no value at all. And that's why we should clear cut everything, why we should overfish all the fisheries, why we should hunt away all the bison, why we should overgraze all the pastures. Everything needs to be converted as rapidly as possible into money, because it's a clear number that can be measured that proves the worth of the thing. So what I'm getting at is that part of what Kenneth does in his philosophy that emerges from this book is that he does a very contra-medieval, contra-modern thing by saying, he's not an ancient, he is a modern, but if you import the physiocratic perspective into your daily life and begin to look at the world as though nature has meaning and significance and potency, it will allow you to see things that you can't see unless you do that. Things that neither medievals nor moderns have been able to see for thousands of years, because we've excluded that perspective. We've said nobody should ever look from that perspective. It's a childish perspective, right? That's what we say under modernism.
But
So
if you want to see God, there's a saying that said, if you want to see God, look at nature.
Yeah. That's right. Thanks, Sharon. Marianne, Donald, Stephen, and Phil. Go ahead, Marianne.
I'm thinking a lot about what you just said, and I think that I'd rather have the rupture of our society rather than the rapture, the end days. I was also thinking about how you talked about moderns being in the pragmatic worldview, and how really I would like to destroy that. And for some reason, I think of circles, and I think of, humanity. When you said the only God is humanity, I was hoping, well, actually more like a yin yang, to take the pragmatic worldview and put humanity in there. But now, since you guys have been talking about nature, I feel like that's too limited. And when you said the only God for moderns is humanity, is there something more that I can conceive of?
Yeah. So, when I said that, there's one thing that I was glossing over, and it's one of the most important things about the way that moderns see humanity, which is that even though we've deified humanity as our God, at the exact same time, we carried over the medieval idea that humanity has no worth unless an external God gives it worth. And since we overthrew an external God, the God that is humanity that we worship has no meaning. We see people as just as disposable as everything else. So the modernist perspective on humanity is simultaneously embracing with great hubris anything our ego wants to do, while at the same time saying nothing really matters, including that. It's a weird contradiction in the way that moderns conceive of human beings. The Queen song, Bohemian Rhapsody, you all familiar with Scaramouche?
Oh, yeah.
Scaramouche, can you do the fandango? There's a line that gets repeated over and over in that song, which is, nothing really matters. Anyone can see, nothing really matters to me. And in a way, and that in the song, that's how he's excusing all the disasters that happened to him and all the things he did wrong. And he's saying, well, yes, it's all terrible, but at least nothing matters, right? That's his out, is trying to flee into nihilism. Because if he cared too much, if he felt like it mattered, it would hurt too much. So there's a way in which moderns really, whether they understand they're doing it or not, even when a modern is a Christian who thinks that they're drawing meaning from God, it's all sitting on top of this modernist construct in which that line from Bohemian Rhapsody is the recurring theme. Nothing really matters. I mean, I've chosen this church instead of that church because for reasons that I don't want to look too closely at. Because as a modern, I think I can pick God. Because God is just a choice, like, a hobby, like whether I like to play bridge versus poker. I can pick the Protestant God or the Catholic God, or I can pick whatever God I want because I'm a modern, because God is subject to my choice. So this is a way in which even when a modern tries to be faithful and religious, they're still moderns. A medieval would never think it was their choice. And an ancient would never think it was their choice who God was. God's God. You're subject to God. You don't get to pick God, right? Trying to tell an ancient Greek that Poseidon isn't real, and they laugh at you. Look, there's the ocean right there. What do you mean it's not real? Go ahead and try to sail out there in a storm, and we'll see who's real, right? They worshipped a thing that was tangibly real. They were like, there's no choice, there's no faith that you don't have to will yourself to believe in the ocean. The ocean's there, right? And in the medieval worldview, there are no other gods but the one God. And you don't have a choice. That's your only choice, and it's not a choice. So, submit. What Islam says in the name of the religion, submission, is very core to the medieval concept, that we are subject to greater things. And we have to just recognize that that's the case. And that if we throw ourselves against the greater things and say, no, I'm greater, then we're just a child throwing a tantrum. And when you contrast these things with the modern perspective that we can pick and choose which God we want to worship, it becomes clear that moderns don't really believe they're gods at all. If they did, in the medieval sense or the ancient sense, they would think we couldn't pick them. They're real, they exist, you're subject to them whether you pick them or not. That's just the way it is. Like not picking whether Mount Rainier is sitting there. Well, it's sitting there. You could disbelieve in Mount Rainier all you want. It's a mountain. That's how they felt about the gods. But in the modern era, we're like, we think we can pick for there to be a mountain there. And it's going to be the mountain of our choice. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's hard to explain how paradoxical and self-contradictory the modernist conception of man is. That on the one hand, man is so great that we can overthrow God and nature and make man be in charge of everything. We'll just decide for ourselves how we're going to do things. But at the same time, having carried forward and imported this medievalist conception that neither man nor nature means anything, and now that we've overthrown God, that doesn't mean anything either. And what we're left with is this great abyss, which Nietzsche warns us, gaze not into that abyss, for it gazes also, right? The moment you start to try to cuddle up to nihilism, it warps and destroys everything. Nietzsche was a huge critic of nihilism. And in the course of that, he was a huge critic of modernism, because he saw that if you scratch the surface of all the ideals of modernism, underneath the surface is this raging abyss in which we've decided that nothing means anything, and therefore we can do whatever we want to do. It's the world of do what we want. So when we think about, well, what is our alternative to this? In some ways, anything is an alternative to this, because we've purified the nihilism. The medievals were sort of like, they were, what's the word I'm looking for? Someone who's not a professional. They were amateurs at nihilism. They only made nature and man be nihilistic, but they kept meaning in God. But moderns have become pros at nihilism, because now for us, everything is nihilist. Nothing has any meaning. And so from this perfect point, it's like being at the South Pole. No matter which direction you go, you're headed north. There's no east or west or south from here. There's only north. And it's the same for modernism. This is such a purified perspective that in some ways, every choice is available to us once we understand the conundrum that we're trapped in, that we've evacuated everything in meaning. So really any source of meaning is an alternative to modernism. Our great challenge is whither from here? I mean, what else is there? Of the infinite choices, where do we go? The previous revolutions, there was only one choice. They felt constrained, right? The medievals had to be what they were in order to rebel against the ancient world the way that they did. The moderns had to rebel against the medievals the way that they did, given the constraints that they were in. But the kind of trap that we're in, almost any direction from here is different once we understand where we are. So anyway, thank you for bringing it up, Marianne. It's just highly stimulating. Donald, then Stephen, then Phil, then Ginny, then Sharon. Go ahead, Donald.
Been doing such a good job of staying quiet. Well, among the three epics, I think there would be some unevenness of understanding, because I think from Hegel, you don't know anything until it's over.
Right.
And modernity, it ain't over yet.
Right.
Correct.
So what Kenneth has here would be insightful, but possibly provisional.
He would agree.
We don't know. Well, maybe there is hope here. If he's really summed up the whole epic, then that means we're getting close to the end. But if he hasn't, then this could go on for a while. Could go on hundreds of years from now. I don't know.
It will.
And I just, that's kind of a paradox. You can't sum it up while you're still in it.
Right.
You know.
You like
and just like those people that look at a beautiful nature scene and say, "Isn't God wonderful?" A friend of mine once said that at the first Thanksgiving, he was pretty sure that John Smith gave thanks to God for putting all those Indians here to help him through that tough winter.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's sort of, God is one of our instruments for Christianity.
Yes.
We can use him to help us get out of a tough situation.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
very modernist.
Very modernist.
Right. Yeah, that's another point worth stressing about the difference between a modern Christian and a medieval Christian. A medieval Christian understood that, God was in charge of everything, and God was working his will out on the matter of the cosmos, including human beings. So when you prayed for enlightenment to know what to do, right? Because, somehow, since God was good, there must be a good outcome to this, and you didn't know what it was yet, but maybe God could help you to see it so that you could align your behavior with God's will. But as moderns, we pray for what we want. It's our will that's in charge. And as Donald points out, God is our mechanism for achieving the things that we want. He's like a tool in our toolbox. And the reason that and I don't mean when I say a modern Christian, I don't mean all modern Christians behave this way, but I mean someone who has fully embraced modernism, who's trying to be Christian at the same time, has inverted the relationship so that, God's like a hammer. When I need a nail struck, I pray to God, and, God will drive in the hammer for me or help me drive in the hammer. But in any way, I don't need him to tell me what to do. I want the right thing. And God's job is to serve that. And they never say it so baldly. They never come out and do it that way. But when you look at the nature of the prayers, so often you can see that that's the modernist take on what a prayer is. The purpose of a prayer is to get what you want, just like the purpose of everything else under modernism is to get what you want.
I was going to say, it's like the Simpsons movie when I think Bart runs into the light pole or something and something bad happens. He's naked skateboarding or something, and I don't know, something terrible.
Right.
And he says to Homer, "This is the worst day of my life." And Homer says, "No, this is the worst day of your life so far."
Right.
So for us modernists,
That's a great line.
You saw that coming, didn't you?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's really what Donald just said is so potent and so important to keep in mind. Kenneth would agree with Hegel on this point, which is that from within the system, you can't fully see the system because you're trying to think about the system using the tools the system has given you to think with. And the system has not given you a complete array of tools. It's given you the tools that, so long as you think using those tools, you will help to perpetuate the system. And the reason it does it that way is not by design, but by convergence. Because any versions of modernism that tried to make a go of things by giving you the tools that if you thought with them would lead to overthrowing the system, those got overthrown. So the only ones that are left are the systems where all the tools they give you feed back into the system. This is how these civilizations evolve in order to be sustainable in the short term. So the irony is Kenneth Smith attempting to reason about modernism from within modernism as a modern. And that's why he tries to import these contra-modern perspectives, the medieval perspective, the ancient perspective, and so on. That's why he's trying to get out of a modernist perspective on how those people saw the world, trying to immerse himself in how they saw the world, in the hopes that that will give him more leverage, an Archimedean standpoint against modernism. But he would agree with Donald 100% that he's only ever going to be able to get partly through that process. Just like we can read Hegel or Marx or even Nietzsche and see the ways in which at the exact same time they're trying to criticize the culture that they're in, they're also trapped by many of the preconceptions of the culture that they're in such a way that, people trying to follow those philosophies too often while thinking that they're rebelling against modernism will just create a new form of modernism, like all the so many different Marxist governments that got set up and became totalitarian themselves. It's like, well, look, it's modernism under a new guise, because Marx could only explain so much without going on to explain things from a modernist perspective that would cause you to recreate the same system in a new flavor. There is this way in which you can't get out from the inside. It's why he keeps recurring to myth and talking about Daedalus. With all of his intelligence, the smartest, cleverest guy in the whole world that ever was, made a trap that even he couldn't get out of. It wasn't until he got out of the plane of the trap and looked back on it that he could see the design that he'd wrought once he was free from it. And that's our problem. When we try to think about the future, when we try to think about what are human beings going to become in the years and centuries and millennia to come, we are playing to our weakness. We are trying to play Cassandra, but the difference is Cassandra could see it all coming because the gods whispered in her ear and told her what was actually going to happen. There are no gods whispering in our ear, giving us pure 100% accurate pictures of the future. It's just us trying to extrapolate a future using the tools that modernism has given us, which means that the future we're extrapolating is rife with modernism. And so thus we're not able to see beyond the event horizon of what comes next. We just haven't put it together and we don't know whether we can. It's an important caution. And without that caution, any philosophy you develop is at risk of becoming an ideology. You do not want to, unless you want to recreate the mistakes of the past, you don't want to promulgate a philosophy that is so easily turned into an ideology that you end up with mass movements out there exterminating people and saying they're doing it in your name. You know, Nietzsche's peaceful afterlife, such as it is, was deeply screwed up by the Nazis and by his sister, and by having all of these people embrace what they thought was Nietzscheism and using it to justify genocide and anti-Semitism. So, you know, it means that whenever you're talking about the future, whether you're Kenneth Smith or anyone else, you have to keep really close to your breast that thing that they used to whisper in Caesar's ear: you are finite, you are mortal, you are full of errors. Anything you're attempting to describe is going to be full of problems. Don't you dare try to get a mass movement going of people who worship your words and think that you're all perfect and all correct, because you are so not. Stephen, then Phil, then Ginny, then Sharon. Go ahead, Stephen.
It's a good note with which to make my point. Down here in Metternich Central, we've noticed a dangerous progressive moment, and that was Rick Marshall when he was in the recent Kenneth Smith thingy we had in Melbourne. If the modern world were to change its educational approaches to help people develop the gnosis side or noesic side of their minds to match, the gnosis side of their minds to match the noesic side, we could be firing on both cylinders, you know. Who knows what we could turn the world into tomorrow, the world.
Yeah, that was a horrible line. It was a horrible line.
Yes, I thought, you know, there's some dangerous ideas. This is trouble, that when we believe we found some answers here, we can make what is apparently a better system.
Yes.
And that's been the modern world, you know, post-World War II. Look at it.
We're making the better
oil
system.
supply, production, off the scale compared to what was preceded it in the 1930s.
Yes.
And we've had all this stuff, and all we can do now is get nasty.
Right. Yeah, at least two big flaws in what I said, probably at least three. One of them would be the modern world would never put together an educational system to develop the gnosic side of the mind, because that goes right to the Achilles heel of modernism. It is the one thing they want to stamp out. They want to create a perfect machine, and you can't create a perfect machine if people are being encouraged to have an experiential relationship to nature and the world. So the whole premise of what I was saying in that sentence is broken. Of course, the second part of that's broken, which is something Kenneth and I have talked about a number of times. Sometimes people criticize Kenneth by saying that he has a program in mind of eugenics, and that he wants to design a race of super people, and that he believes that he can transform people to be better. And one of Kenneth's responses to this is that there's few things he's more against than eugenics, and to have been turned on his head in such a way reminds him of Nietzsche being turned on his head and being presented as pro, German nationalism. So Kenneth says, the thing that you learn from the ancients about human character is that it is lawful. It is nature itself in action. People have drives within them to unfold who they are going to become. And those drives are not arbitrary choices that are ours to pick and choose from. That's a modernist idea. The idea that you can decide what somebody else will become is a modernist idea. All these programs for mass manufacturing people are modernist ideas. A counter-modernist reaction, an ancient reaction, would be that people, as experienced parents will often tell you, little children show signs of who they're going to become way in advance of actually becoming those people. And that as parents, you can sort of midwife that along a little bit, but you can't actually change it. And if you try to hammer that child into not being who they were going to become and into becoming somebody that you would prefer instead, what you end up with is generational trauma, not a success. You can't mold people to become what you will them to be. They are organisms, and they're going to unfold into who they're going to be. And therefore, all eugenics programs are doomed, says Kenneth Smith. He says, I would never propose such a stupid idea from a dialectical Heraclitean perspective, something that is so obviously could never succeed. So he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to make.
Kind of goes along with what happens to Oedipus Rex.
Sure.
What you just said, doesn't it? Like his life was already destined to move in that direction.
It was unfolding.
Right.
Unfolding. Yeah, and in Oedipus, the idea is the misunderstanding, his parents' misunderstanding of the prophecy. They think it's a warning that the gods are going to make this happen if Oedipus stays with them. But that's not how the Greek gods work. They're not like the Hebrew gods or the Christian gods or the Muslim gods. The way the Greek gods worked is they're elements of nature in action. And when they give a prophecy, they're not saying, I'm going to make this happen, or it's going to happen unless you exert your will and intervene. They're saying, let me describe a piece of nature that is unfolding for you, because you should know about this, that it's going to happen. And, they never promised that it was going to happen, that it would stop happening if the parents intervened and tried to change things. Indeed, the working of the prophecy may have been that the only way that it could happen is because of the nature of the parents, that they would try to change things in such a way that they set up exactly the thing they were trying to escape from, right? It's like, that's the thing, So as with Oedipus, so with eugenics, what Kenneth Smith is saying is that it's not up to us who our children become. We can try to give them a healthy culture so that they can become the healthiest version of whoever they're going to become that they can become, but we can't make them be a certain character type or get a certain outcome to happen. All we can do is surround them with opportunities to develop and hope that it comes out well, and that's what a culture would do instead of an anti-culture. An anti-culture would try to work a child like a piece of metal and turn them into a tool for production. But an actual culture would just surround the child with support and opportunities and let them unfold however they're going to unfold. And so as a result, when we talk about the future and where people are going to develop, similarly, an existentialist perspective on that is that it's not ours to control. This is the third and final thing I'd say that's wrong with the sentence that I said. So I'm glad Stephen brought it up, is that we don't get to dictate terms to the future. And if we did, we would screw it up. Our minds are full of problems. And the more power we're given, the more powerful our mistakes. And if we're given the power to shape the whole world and shape civilizations, we're going to create monumental, colossal mistakes on a scale that we can never dream of. So really, we're not in charge, and it's best that we're not in charge. We should be focusing on what's healthy and not on trying to, control. So thanks, Stephen. I appreciate it. Phil, and then Ginny, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I wonder whether this is really just a natural outcome of civilization itself. That we have developed such a sophisticated and complex society that we become dependent. And it seems to me it's a little bit like a bee colony, like they're so entrenched into the system that all you have to do is capture the queen bee. Of course, they do have a backup system. They could make another queen. So in some sense, you're almost dependent, because if you're a worker, you are just a worker. Mm-hmm. You don't mean anything except to sustain the colony itself. Same thing with ants. And the difference is that our thing is infiltrated into a mind. We do still have choice. But, in the old days, it seems to me the prophet was creating these utterances. He doesn't really govern the structure itself. Mm-hmm. He says these things, and you could take it or leave it. Most of the time you leave it, sometimes you take it. But it's just sort of like whispering in your ear, about what happens. Now it seems to me the prophets are within the system itself and in control of it. And when you particularly have such a system in which power is now the primary source, that's one of the reasons why I still, despite my criticism about science, I still very much believe in it as a kind of prophet, because it just sort of have these utterances. I'm always surprised, particularly with astronomy. These guys, they will see worlds and this is completely different than what we thought it was. It's just incredible. Which, by the way, also says that they are expanding the whole definition of nature. It's completely different. We expect that water is a necessary structure of life, and now we realize that sometimes there may be excess water and life can develop and all that kind of stuff, And so in some sense, but what becomes a problem is that science has become slowly being bought off by industry into technology, that it becomes no longer just a profit, but in some sense within the structure. And that's what makes it from this sort of mystery of wondering like, oh, what is it? What could it possibly be, to something that's going to be a productive part that's integrated into a tool within the system of domination. And I this then reminds me back to when I saw AlphaGo, right? Mm-hmm. That we have become so dependent on the game that in a sense, the system could just simply overpower us, because it recognized that this world champion in game 4 could possibly transcend the structure. And the system itself, although it's mechanical, sort of recognize that's one area it can't really control. And who knows, he might come up with something and win the 5th game, right? So it moved in such a way that in a sense, and you're shocked because you think that they're very inventive, but it took a while for them to realize, no, he's just playing a game of power that eventually forced you to have to make the move to make sure that, you stay in relationship to him and finally win. I mean, the system wins. And so therefore, in a sense, have we become so dependent that we are, on the one hand, we know that we have to exist within the system, but on the other hand, how could we even criticize the system when we are dependent on it? It's become so viable as what I said as a ecology 2, that in a sense we can no longer really be allowed to see ecology 1 anymore. But especially since ecology 1 has now expanded to some dimension that we never knew before. So in some sense, and then I think the scientists are now, the astronomers are interested in not only finding new information, maybe life is quite limited, because all we have to do is find water and everything will okay, because there's, cosmic spermia that could deliver the living information, and then somehow it's a balance between the two. And so they're not interested in these other things, but let's find the source. And if we find out that Earth and life is very, very rare, then maybe we should rethink that life is perhaps more fundamental than even knowledge, because we can't seem to find it. Now, what if we do find, oh yeah, it's actually somewhere else as well. Right. Then in a sense, you could almost begin to disobey and not try to destroy the only life source there is. So I just sort of wonder whether we're just trapped by that structure itself, especially when it's manipulated by the power of psychopaths. Because in the old days, even psychopaths could only whisper into the ear of the ruler. But nowadays, the psychopath has taken control of the system.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Phil. Ginny and then Sharon. Go ahead, Ginny.
I'm going back to several conversations that you had earlier, Rick, when you were talking about how we humans think that we control nature and blah, blah, blah. Well, I keep thinking of the rainforest in Amazon rainforest in Brazil, and how they have burned down so much of the forest, thinking that if they could turn it into a farmland, and it turns out it was not meant to be a farmland, but in the process, destroying the biosphere of this very complicated and amazing Right? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And it's such a tragedy. It's such a blasphemy what they did to the rainforest. But I was just Googling. Is that on its way back though? I mean, is it going through recovery now? Do you know anything about that?
Well, the pace of deforestation in the Amazon hasn't slowed down; it's accelerated.
It's still going.
Yeah, Jaime Bolsonaro realized that the indigenous peoples of the Amazon were resisting, the things that he wanted to do, and that the easiest, just like in North America, how they figured out if they murdered all the bison, then the tribes would collapse. Bolsonaro now has an explicit policy that if he can destroy as much of the Amazon as possible, then the tribes in there will collapse, and they'll lose power and they won't be able to resist him. Yeah. So he's actually accelerated the process of destruction in order to strengthen his control. And of course, it'll be a disaster, but he doesn't care. He's not president of Brazil later when it's a disaster. He's president of Brazil now when he's trying to get more power. So he sacrifices the future for the present in the way that moderns typically do. It's a classic move.
When you hear things like what you can find in the rainforest could cure cancer, for example, there's such plant diversity, and there's so much in the diversity that could help the human race with many ills and sickness and all that. That's another thing that just really is a tragedy.
Yeah.
Well, but you have to consider that there's also the question of fairness, right? Because that's when it was brought up to me, like 25 years ago, or actually now 35 years ago, when I was in Texas, that some people, ecologists, were buying sectors of the Amazon forest in order to protect it. I did ask the question like, well, how is that fair? Like, you get to annihilate the prairies and the buffaloes and become a rich country. And now you're telling us, let's sacrifice and try to save the rainforest, right? So there's a different level of fairness, and I think the underdeveloped countries are asking that fairness. Should you pay for some stipend of you getting ahead? And now you want to say, now let's do what's right, right? Let's do what's right. So therefore, the fairness to nature also is pitted against the fairness of the development of other countries. So it's a more complex issue. Not that I'm for burning up the rainforest. Obviously, I'm not. But what I'm saying is they actually ask a question that needs to be asked and needs to be answered in a more fair way than let's say, oh, just now don't do it. But you did it. You got ahead. Now you're going to stay ahead. And also, okay, even if they save the Amazon rainforest, other burning up Borneo. Right. There are other rainforests that's completely being destroyed as well. I'm sure that's happening in Africa, and Africa is the source of the raw materials. And what are they supposed to exploit? I mean, so we have to answer that deep questions about fairness to other cultures as well. In the meantime, as we talk about the fairness to nature and the ecosystem. So, so that's a more complex issue than just say, everybody stop, let's just start replanting. Ask the people who have destroyed to start replanting, and that might be a slightly more fair way of distribution.
Yeah, if there were easy answers to these things, we would have all figured them out and left long ago. But instead, we're caught up in these complex webs that are just mind-boggling to try to unravel. And
no. There's no such a thing as an easy answer because, greedy, right? And you've been talking about the greed has pushed human race to move forward in the way that they have moved. Right?
Yeah, I mean, going to Donald's issue about, are we truly at the end of modernism, or are we centuries away from the end? Are we in the middle of modernism? God help us, are we at the beginning of modern? Where are we in this thing? And of course, we can't tell. But looking at the previous two epochs, one of the ways to tell is that by the end of the ancient epoch, there was nowhere else to go. Everything had become so corrupt and tangled up that there was no way out. And the medieval revolution really offered the only escape. The same was true for the degree of corruption of the church at the end of the medieval epoch. It was just unacceptable, insurmountable, inescapable. It had to be, there was no way forward except to overthrow it. So one of the guidelines for looking at the modern world is, if you look around and there's still ways for the modern system to work, then modernism isn't done yet. The way that we'll know that whatever is going to come next is going to come next is when we reach the point where there are no further answers within modernism, and the only way to go forward is something else. And I think for all that populists would try to say that we are already at that stage, or have been saying it for centuries, it's obviously not true. There's obviously more that modernism can do. So we must not be at the end of it yet. We may be in late modernism, but we're not at the end of modernism. And therefore, our perspective on modernism is just that much more deeply trapped within modernism than we might have thought. When Marx wrote, he wrote as though he was at the very end, and any day now, it was all going to be overthrown. And that's obviously not the case. As history has demonstrated, he got that so completely wrong.
I just want to inquire here, these views of the popularists, is there a link I can follow? I might want to join.
Oh, populism?
Yes, this view, you seem to have associating a number of views with the populace. You know, I'd be curious about this.
Yeah, no idea.
How about the ones back in ancient Rome? They were into something, weren't they?
Yeah, they were onto something.
Okay, you're giving the populace a bad rap, who I'm one of. So,
well, so am I. So's Kenneth. We're all part of the populace together. We're all exactly the same. Sharon, and then I'm going to jump in, and then Marianne. So go ahead, Sharon.
So I just wanted to clarify one point, Rick. And when you were talking about, because this point is really near and dear to my heart, when you talked about the difference between the modern Christian and the medieval Christian, right? So the medieval Christian, and I'm not going to identify the time period exactly, tended to follow the strict rules and laws laid down by Christianity. And the teachings of Jesus Christ, which encourage more of a partnership with God. Because if you look at the Lord's Prayer, where it says, thy will be done. So you're praying, but you're also asking for his will. So you don't pray because you're not going to automatically get what you ask for.
Right.
There is still the deference to his power.
Right.
I just wanted to correct that point.
Yes.
And then, not correct, but I just wanted to make that point.
Yes.
And then there's this paragraph in the middle of the last page where I wanted you to amplify it for me. It says, modern ego knows itself as a self-begotten anomaly, like Baron von Munchausen pulling himself up by his own top knot. Now, in medicine, there's the Munchausen syndrome, where you want to pretend to be sick and you hurt yourself, right? Yeah. So I was trying to figure out how to fit all of this together. And then before my turn gets done, I like the summation that Kenneth Smith does at the very end of the page. And if you will allow me to read it, it says, just as ancient naturalism, fatalism, is a cogent a priori way of making sense of life and history, and just as medieval spiritualism, radical moralism is also a cogent or apodotic on its own terms, so the modern worldview of arbitrary will seem ultimate and logical within the ideological cosmos it propagates. In the next few sentences, he goes on to say that because we have adopted this style of functioning, then we're going to lose any vantage point for discriminating where to go and how we are. And I thought that was a very nice summary.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, it's tricky to talk about modernist Christianity versus moderns who happen to be Christians versus people who are trying to live a medieval Christian worldview but live in the modern age versus, there's so many different groups here. And Christians often use the term Christianity to refer to all of the sects of Christianity, including the ones who believe exactly opposite things. And so it makes it a tough thing to talk about. So when I talk about modernist Christianity, I'm not saying that everybody who's a Christian today always says God should give me what I want. And certainly even the people who are doing that don't think of it that way. They think they know God's will, that they've studied God, that they've been immersed in the Bible, and that they're godly people and are saved. The ones I'm talking about, this particular tradition in modernism. And that because of that, they know that they're asking a legitimate thing that is probably what God wants to do anyway. So why doesn't he just give them the thing? And, you know, you see plenty of people who practice Christianity in the modern age who don't do it that way. Plenty who don't. And what we're seeing in that difference is partly what he talks about when he says there are shards of medievalism that are still present in us, in our culture at large, but also in us individually. And likewise, there's shards of the ancient worldview that are still present in our culture and are still present in us. And so you can today find Christians who try their best to do the medieval thing, who try to be subject to God's will, who try to be enlightened and to know what God wants. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm just saying there is this strong current under modernism, and there's a reason why you see things like the prosperity gospel today, because it is a way to restructure Christianity to make it more amenable to the marketplace and to modernism.
The evangelicals.
Well, some evangelicals are this way and some aren't, right? They're diverse as well. There's all these different shards. And the problem is they can all call themselves Christians because Christians have never said this is Christianity and this is not Christianity in any way that's been binding upon them. When the medieval church tried to do that, it caused more schisms rather than fewer schisms. So there's not a union around a clear core set of beliefs that everybody has to believe in order to call themselves the thing. And so that's how you can get people who, on the one hand, are like, you know, a rich man can't pass through the eye of a needle. You know, a rich man's not going to get into heaven as easily as a camel could get through an eye of a needle. Though some people will embrace Jesus's statement about poverty and wealth, and other people will turn around and say, well, if God loves me, he'll give me lots of money, and have whole churches and mega churches built on this prospect and not see any contradiction at all between what Jesus said and what they're saying. They're able to reconcile the two because under modernism, more than any previous epoch, we have this capacity to see ourselves in, as he said in the opening of this chapter, a schizoid way, where we can be full of contradictions and not see the contradictions themselves. We can modulate back and forth between, you know, God, Jesus is pro-poverty and pro-sharing wealth on the one hand, and then in the next moment say, and he's going to give me a lot of money, and not realize that just a moment ago we said something that was a contradiction. Moderns, it's easier to have these contradictory thoughts side by side in us. And the reason is that it's all based on nihilism and relativism and subjectivity. The same failure to align around a source of meaning under modernism that manifests everywhere else also manifests when we try to understand our own beliefs, where we have a tolerance for contradiction while being able to cloak it within an impression that there's no contradiction there at all. This is a really modern trick. It's not that nobody's ever done it, it's that we do it on a mass scale and with an intensity never seen before. So that's really all I'm trying to get at is that, you know, not that all Christians are one thing, on the contrary, they're remarkably diverse under modernism, but that you can see, like televangelism is another classic example of a very modernist phenomenon, where you get people saying, you know, like Pat Robertson has said, this hurricane is going to destroy New Orleans unless you send me money. If you send me enough money, God won't destroy New Orleans. And enormous numbers of people who believe that they're Christians will send him money in order to save New Orleans from God's wrath. And you're like, this? You think this is Christianity? In what version of Christianity do you think that this is? Where in the scriptures does it say, and there shall come among you televangelists who need your money to intercede on God's behalf to keep him from destroying you? This is not something you can find right in there. But the contradictions somehow are able to coexist under modernism. because we have this high tolerance for things that don't make sense together. Someone can wrap themselves in enough of the symbols and leave out the spirit of the thing, and we don't notice the spirit is missing because we almost don't believe in spirit. So yeah.
I'm wondering what percentage of people think like that, the way you just described these, these Pat Robertson followers or whatever.
I have no idea. I mean,
Jenny, there's no actual measurements. It's like for evangelicals now, the three focal points of religion are immigration, homosexuality, and abortion. None of those are the teachings of Jesus. But
right.
That's the central tenet that they talk about. Even the Catholics, forgive me, anybody here who's Catholic. And one of the things that I appreciate is the plurality of faith, not just Christianity. So that's Buddhism and Hinduism. That's my MO. But it's difficult to ascribe any specific percentage to who believes what, because it's a constant changing medium.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like what we could really use is some clarity about these things, but there is no science of religion that goes through and comes up with metrics to try to figure out what actual religions exist regardless of what they call themselves. There's no science of religion that can say, well, this appears to be Christianity and these prosperity gospel people call themselves Christian, but when we measure them against these tenets, they're clearly not. They must be this other thing. There's none of that exists. There's no clear metric.
Correct.
And so as a result, it all becomes a muddle of self-identification, self-reporting, and very passionate identity politics, where people say, I have always been a Christian. I don't care if I believe that rich people are the best people and that poor people suck. I'm still a Christian, and nobody can tell me I'm not even Jesus, right? There is this level of willfulness about self-identity that's kind of run amok under modernism, that makes it very hard to get clarity about how many people of what kinds are around. So part of the reason I stuck my hand up was to try to, maybe before today's session ends, get to the second half of the first sentence, which, I started with the very clash of meanings of the millennium, right? And all of this is launched from that opening phrase. And I think this underscores part of what I'm trying to get at. It's not that we went off topic. It's that the topic is so pregnant. There's so much here, right? This is just a cornucopia of philosophical material that he's opening a can of at the beginning of the sentence. And then he says, and this comes relevant to what we've talked about, it illustrates the cleavage of ideological dimensions that besets moderns, the cleavage of ideological dimensions, right? To be modern is to have a cleavage of ideological dimensions. So we are not aligned cleanly along one set of shared beliefs. That's not a modern thing. We have a variety of beliefs that don't exist in our mind as any kind of organic ecosystem. They don't exist in harmony with each other. They don't exist in symbiotic relationship to each other. They exist in crystalline purity, side by side, cleaved from one another into separate lenses for seeing the world. He's evoking crystals with cleavage. This is what he's after here. He's trying to, and crystals to relate it to lenses. This idea that there are non-organic, mechanistic fragments within us, and that the way our mind is constructed that's different from any previous epoch is, it's not just that we have a variety of ideas. It's not just that we've been exposed to a diversity, but that modernism encourages a Frankensteinian approach to building a mind in which radically incompatible ideas can exist side by side in our mind at the same time. We can modulate back and forth between them using them, while the whole time thinking that we're not doing that. Thinking that we're thinking with one coherent, objective lens on the world, not realizing that in one breath, we're speaking like a modern, and the next breath we're speaking like a medieval, and the next breath we're speaking like an ancient. And that if we ever put these ideas side by side in front of us consciously, we'd look at them and realize they're incompatible with each other. They don't actually make sense in terms of each other. We're mechanically hopping tracks all the time, even in the course of a single sentence, between worldviews, and not realizing we're doing it. We have a deep incoherency in the structure of our mind that we don't see. And that deep incoherency explains an enormous amount about human behavior in the modern world. Things that we can't explain as clearly because we don't recognize that we're doing that. We try to explain our behavior as though we have a coherent picture of the world. And if we had a coherent picture of the world, we wouldn't behave this way. How can it be that so many of these things can be side by side that are incompatible with each other in our behavior, in our subcultures, in our economy, in our politics? And the answer is that level of fragmentation starts right here. We're fragmented that way. Once you can see from the perspectives of multiple epochs, a modern becomes unmistakable because the level of fragmentation of our thinking is unprecedented. The more you engage in gnosic thinking, the harder it is to exist in a fragmented state. Gnosis is about forming wholes, experientially immersing yourself in the world. Another way to say that is forming a combination of yourself and the world that makes a greater whole. Gnosis is a whole-forming, whole-seeking mode of thought. And so the more you engage in gnosis, even when you relate to your own mind, you start to reconcile differences. You start to notice differences and reconcile them together and try to create a whole organism of the mind. But noesis doesn't work that way. Noesis works by separating things. Science, schism, shingle, scintillate, all these words derive from the same root, which is to split, which takes us back to Phil and splitting the stone, right? We break up big problems into little problems. We study the little problems separately. We make little equations for each one. We put all the equations together and say we now have a model of the whole. But what we have is a model of a bunch of pieces, right? There's a schisming process. This is the core of what the analytical noetic function of the mind is. This is its great power. Its power to look at a great tangled Gordian knot of nature and to say, well, that's too much to think about. But if I take this piece out of isolation, I can study it and make sense of it and start to predict that one piece, as long as all else is equal. Splitting is at the core of that process. But the side effect of engaging in an enormous amount of the splitting mode of the mind is that inside of our own mind, we start to have increasing numbers of split fragments, each of which reasons differently about the world than the fragment that's right next to it. It's the extremity of our noesis that results in the extremity of the mechanization of our own mind and its splitting into lots of little fragments and lenses. There's a direct relationship. And he's alluding to it in this opening sentence indirectly. He's going to talk about it in great detail in the rest of the book. He's really going to explore this. But it's one of the defining characteristics of modernism. And what's interesting about it is that from a modern perspective, it's not possible. We can't possibly be that incoherent in our minds because we have a natural born birthright as moderns to see the world the way it really is. We're born free, we're born objective. All the hard problems of philosophy, as moderns, we don't have any of them. We're just born having the answers to those things. And if you know that in your heart of hearts, then it's inconceivable to you that your mind can be a bunch of fragments that don't make sense together. Right? It's our big blind spot. And it's why it's fragmented, because we never can turn and look at it and see the problem that's there. We've got it papered over with propaganda that says we are this way, and ergo there's no problem to look for in here. So when he talks about this, up until now we've focused on the cleavage, we've focused on the lenses, we focused on the fragments, but another model he's going to use at the same time throughout this essay is dimensions. And another model he's going to use is ideology. When he talks about ideology, he's alluding to Kierkegaard. He's alluding to a delusion as a state of mind in which the thing you most need to think in order to escape the delusion is the thing you're least able to think. The delusion rules out the escape from the delusion. It's a circular, self-enclosing mode of thinking that traps you. And that's how Kenneth defines an ideology. He says all ideologies are systematic delusions. They're systems of self-reinforcing delusions that prevent you from seeing outside of their perspective. And there's an element to which every culture is to some extent kind of an organic ideology, but not really. The more organic it is, the less ideological it is. But as we move into an anti-culture like modernism, where things become increasingly noetic, they can also become increasingly ideological, where we think according to algorithms and recipes that tell us what the right answer is through the law of the excluded middle. and through our memorized systems of thought. And as we do that, the ideologies think for us, and we enter a less conscious state, a sort of autonomic state in which our mind is just along for the ride, playing out the recipe that it's memorized for how you get to the answer that the ideology wants you to arrive at, or that it will tolerate. So he wants to combine these three metaphors, the lenses / fragments of the mind, that each one of these is an ideology, that whenever you're in that lens, it thinks for you. You're unconscious for the duration of your time spent in that lens. And that as a consequence of that, to understand the human mind, to understand even your own thinking, what you have to understand is that you've got multiple ideologies that were never designed to go together, never evolved to go together, each of which is trying to pursue its own goals to maximize whatever the ends are of the medieval world, or the ends of the ancient world, or the ends of the modern world, and that they're competing with each other, and one by one taking over the reins of our mind to steer it in a different direction. So as a result, we're going every which way in our thinking while thinking that we're moving in a straight line. We can't see the ways in which in one moment we're starting to move forward, and in the next moment we're starting to move exactly backwards again, because now it's the medieval lens we're looking through. But the more we learn to see that that's going on, the more that we learn to map out these different intersecting dimensions that are operating in our mind at the same time, the more we can start to create the possibility for some genuine choice and freedom to become a person, and not just to be a symptom of all of these competing ideologies that are acting out at us. So all of this is sort of buried in this first sentence. You know, and knowing Kenneth, since he had time to work on this column, I know he reworked that sentence over and over and over and over and over until he got to where he could say an entire book in a sentence. Even if nobody gets that it's there, he knows that he said it, right? So how do you know that I'm not overinterpreting Kenneth? Well, one of Kenneth's favorite quotes is from Nietzsche. Nietzsche has a quote where, and I know because he stuck it at the front of one of his books. And Nietzsche has a quote where he says, "It is my goal to say in 10 sentences what someone else says in a book. No, what someone else does not say in a book." He wants that level of compression where a single sentence can explode with meanings and possibilities that you could think about for months or years to come. That was one of Nietzsche's goals. It's why he wrote in parables so often, and it's one of Kenneth's goals. When Kenneth is in a hurry, he doesn't have the time to do that philosophical concentration, that kind of borderline poetry that Heraclitus did. But when he's got time, when he's got a deadline that's a ways off and he has time to prepare, like he did with this opening installment for this column, you know he's going to rework that sentence and try to jam a whole bunch of extra meaning in there, because it's one of his core goals as a writer and as a philosopher. So if anything, I'm underinterpreting the sentence. It's part of what makes Kenneth Smith interesting as a writer, is that it rewards revisiting multiple times because he's really worked to pack more stuff in there. So that was what I wanted to add while we still had time today, because I know we were running out of time. I wanted to get us through at least one sentence. And I thank Sharon for taking us on a little tour of some of the rest of the essay in order to help pull it back together, you know, and to see the larger context. But you know, it'll be rewarding to work our way through this, because he's got so much jammed in here that's rich and pregnant. So Stephen, and then Donald, and then Phil. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
How do you know there aren't missing pieces?
Exactly.
In the old system, they believed in an all-powerful God, and you might think, well, he's not trying to bugger me around.
Right.
So God's going to make me a jigsaw puzzle which has got all the pieces. So it's up to me to make the picture.
Exactly.
But I think I've expressed this before to you. I think I did last week, where I'm always amazed at the atheist, sort of rationalist, humanist crowd who carry on that tradition of the perfect world order. Okay, if you've got an all-powerful cosmic granddaddy up in the sky, that's almost believable. But when you're basing the world on a system which is a product of blind chance, and yet you're still telling me all your jigsaw puzzles have no missing pieces, how do we know the human CPU doesn't have holes in it?
Right. It just begs the question. It begs you to ask the question. if the reason that you knew you had all the jigsaw puzzle pieces before is because God is all knowing and all powerful and all good, so of course he would give you all the pieces. But then you throw out God, well, then why do you still assume that you've got all the puzzle pieces? You know, how do you know that you've got all the puzzle pieces? Because you removed the one thing that could have guaranteed that they were all there is now no longer part of your worldview. Why should we think that your mind makes sense anymore? And the answer is because it's more convenient to believe that than not to believe it, is literally all they've got to show. It's one of the Achilles heels of modernism, is that, you know, once you pull all sources of reliable meaning out from under the foundations, what you're left with is a whole bunch of questions about why should we believe any of this even is going to work. You're right, Stephen. It's a major flaw in the worldview. Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald.
Just quickly, I wanted to say, I'm assuming the Viking wedding is over, and and I'm thankful. As someone who is bearded myself, mine can't get anywhere near that length before it would drive me crazy. I think I would have my face removed. But yeah, and I don't know. Kenneth's first book was Studies in Ideology and Nihilism.
Yes.
Which is probably not, I don't know. I have 2 copies of it, and those are the only 2 I know he sold. Because you got one? So you paid, it was like $3 or something. But it does go through movements that were popular in the 60s and 70s and show their ideological and nihilistic content.
Right.
So it's pretty good. I mean, one of the things that's always amazed me when we talk about this is, like, Marx certainly was one that warned about the dangers of ideological thinking and tried to get out of that. And yet almost all follow-on Marxist inspired whatever movements are ideological.
Yes.
They can't talk about actual work or labor or capital or anything. It's all, there's no evidence that can disprove any of their thing. There's no, it's lost contact with the world in that thought circle. But I mean, it's not just Marxist movements. It's movements all over the world, and movements seemingly, like we hit on today, that seem to be very diverse. They're either religious or political or humanistic or whatever. But when you look at them, they all show those characteristics of modernity.
Mm-hmm.
They become undisprovable. One of the few things that probably science still clings to, that you still hear a few scientists say, you know, it can't even be wrong. That's the worst thing they can say about something.
Mm-hmm.
It's so bad it can't be wrong, which means no possible disproof.
Doesn't make enough sense to be wrong.
You're right. Well, enough. We're at the end. But,
yeah, we're coming up on the end. Yeah,
still today, Donald.
The thing he does in ideology, he studies in ideology and nihilism is definitely core Kenneth Smith culture criticism. It doesn't have a lot of sugar, so you can see why he didn't sell as well as some of his other books. But part of the reason is that we all enjoy culture criticism when it's directed at some other ideology that we despise. We're like, haha, yeah, see, right, what he said, you guys suck. But then when he turns around and does it to your ideology, then suddenly we hate it. We're like, no, we are not. You suck. It's like, we don't want our ideologies to be diagnosed. We want their ideologies to be diagnosed. And Kenneth's insistence that all ideologies suck and that we should think in a non-ideological way. But to do that, we have to learn what the symptoms are of an ideology so that we can catch ourselves doing it. And again, on top of that, the idea that as moderns, we have an addiction to simplicity and falsehood that we don't recognize in ourselves. There's a reason why ideologies keep springing up over and over under modernism at a ferocious pace. It's because they offer us simple answers, and nobody's ever craved simple answers as much as we did. The medievals were full of the mystery of God, right? The world's a mysterious place because God's mysterious. So there's all kinds of questions you could look into. There's all kinds of things that we haven't explored and don't understand. But as moderns, we think we get to understand it all. And of course, since it's infinite and that's not possible, we opt for an ideology which appears to explain it all while actually just being a circle in our thinking. There's a reason we keep being trapped by these things. And so, he'd say the first step towards getting out of the trap of modernism is learning to not only detest their ideologies, but to learn to detest our ideologies too, and to get to where you don't want any ideology anywhere near you any more than you'd want to stick your finger in poop. It's like, I don't really want any part of that. When you can get to that stage, you start to have the necessary immune system to get some distance from all the little tentacles that are trying to pull you back into modernism. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I myself do not believe in God, but I do believe in the divine spirit. And the question I have is, if the divine spirit is posited in nature, is there some spirit that's left over that the spirit is keeping secret, and that therefore simply understanding nature is also incomplete? Or is the divine spirit also in an evolutionary process, and it is complete now as it is, but the spirit itself is evolving? So therefore it grows with the evolution of the material world? Or is it just an excess that's left over for us not to know, or for that has not been revealed yet? So I kind of think that going back to the experiment of the blind spot, I've always questioned, like, how much is in the senses itself, and how much is in the mind to reconstitute that spirit, And I think it's important to examine both. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think, when you ask me, how many did you count? I have to say, I don't know. I suppose I could say 4.5 to see the difference, but I refuse to say that as well, because I didn't count 4.5.
Right, you counted 5.
I experienced 5, and I couldn't tell whether it was actually 3, 4, or 5. So therefore, it left to be a question, and I think that criticism means I have to criticize myself, and therefore, like I said, I doubt only myself and the system, right. But I also wonder. I don't quite want to say I doubt the divine spirit, but I question whether he's got a secret joker hidden, or whether he's also developing as I am developing, as nature is developing. I do not know. I do not know that answer. It's ambiguous. So I live in that ambiguous zone to a certain degree.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil.
If you're happy there, that's all that matters. And I just want to say, if I may, Rick, to this, because I know we're over time, I don't think there are any answers to any of those questions, Phil. A journey on this earth is what we choose to believe. And in Christianity, faith is defined as being sure of what you do not see and certain of what you hope for. And it's not evidentiary. None of it is. You either know or you don't know. It's the knowing and the seeing again, right? So it's up to you. It's how you're going to navigate your journey. It's that simple.
Well, you're forcing me to say 4.5. And I'm not going to say that.
So, we may have only really fully got through one sentence today, but it was an important sentence. And it does, in fact, set up the whole rest of the book very nicely. I think part of what's going to be interesting about the 6 months ahead that we go through this book is that doing a deep dive on the ancient worldview and on the medieval worldview is fascinating. It's fascinating to see how they conceived of God and the gods and nature radically different from the way we do.
Yes.
And as a consequence of that, how they conceived of humanity and what is our role in life, radically different than we do. For me, this column, when he came out with it in the Comics Journal, was my first real exposure to looking at medieval spirituality in its own terms. It had never been presented to me that way. It had always been presented to me in a judgmental way from a modernist perspective, with moderns saying, haha, they're wrong and we're right. I'd never really had the chance to say, well, what did they think in their own right? And so questions of, the nature of the divine, what is the nature of spirit and soul, all this stuff, we're going to get into all that, at least from a Smithian perspective.
I think it'd be fascinating to see all the angry comments that were railed against Kenneth in those columns.
Oh, God, they hate him.
Yes. Yes.
That could be the final book, the world contra Kenneth.
The posthumous Kenneth Smith book, a collection of all the hate mail ever sent in response to Kenneth Smith.
Because I've looked the guy up and you just don't really find interest in him for some reason. Like, okay, right. Is he that bad that there can be no interest? There's not a Wikipedia on Kenneth Smith and they say, oh, this guy's full of rubbish. No, but not even that. He's been made into an unperson. He's suffered the worst fate of all.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it is, it partly goes back to his love of deflating ideologies. If you aren't willing to take sides in the ideological wars of modernism, if you insist that all ideologies are wrong and you criticize them all, you're not left with an audience. Sooner or later.
He's a bubble burster, is he?
Yeah, right.
He's a man.
So he's not very greedy. He's not very interested in making money then, huh?
I've asked him about this, and he always gives a rueful laugh. He says, under modernism, it would sure be nice to be able to pay your bills, but sadly, there's something in him that holds it in contempt, so that he finds himself in economic distress for his whole life.
Yeah, he doesn't mind being poor.
He's reassured by the joy of being able to puncture balloons.
Well, we should all, and many times I do, give thanks to Angela. Yes. She is the enabler behind Kenneth.
Yes.
She's and I know the one thing I think that just the title, of course, it was in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. In his book was, I think, like Nazism and women's lib, which was a real eye opener because it was a popular political movement, and he took it apart as having all the defining characteristics of a totalitarian movement, completely. And he did that in that book. He does that to a lot. So I think he lost his audience day one, right out the gate.
Out of the gate. Step one, book one, offend everybody.
Right. And then, but I'll have to say that was the book that when I read it, I said, there might be something in philosophy,
So next week, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead, Sharon.
So next week, we're going to do this one more time. Going to go through it again.
Oh, we'll move on to sentence number 2, and hopefully we'll get through more than one. Although it is worth noting that Nietzsche's quote, which is the next sentence, is a doozy.
So Phil, we're reading the same thing next week. Essay number 2, Time, History, and Nature.
I'm gonna ask Rick to send me an email with a direct link, so I'll be certain of at least one thing.
It's in the chat right now. It's in the
It's
chat,
in the chat right now. So open it and save it to your desktop.
All right.
Right there.
What is at the bottom?
Yeah, just pasted it. That's
Okay.
David gave us that. It's on the meetup invite, but there it is too.
Okay, good. I'll copy that and paste that and be certain of one thing.
Just open it. Open
It's
it.
4.5. Okay.
Phil, open it. And when it comes up, save it to your desktop. That's the
Okay.
easiest way.
All right. That's what I'll do then. I'll open it right now. Okay. There we go.
Yes.
No. It's somehow it's still with end of times. What is going on here?
Oh yeah, if you click on it, Kenneth Smith, End Times 2, Time, History, and Nature. That's what it should
Time,
say.
history, and nature. Okay. Okay, I see. This is the dramas of the mind. Okay.
No, that's on the left.
No, that's on the left.
Ignore
Okay.
that. That's a menu on the left.
Okay. Just ignore that altogether.
Yeah,
Yes.
focus on the white part of the page.
Okay. All right. I'll save that and
Then
Okay.
right click and go to save as. And
save page as. Okay.
Yeah.
No,
I got
save
it.
as and hit desktop and it should go do it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Sure.
We're looking out for you, Phil.
All right.
We need all your comments.
All right. Thanks a lot.
And with that, it's been great. I'll see you all next week.
All right.
Thank you, Rick.
Have a
Thank you,
nice
David.
week. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Rick.